Chapter 25, Risk and Reward. When the glimmer of a luxurious reward teases you, what risks are you willing to take in order to reap it? LLL. She watched him with hard eyes and stoic features, no shred of emotion crossing her face, a near-perfect reflection of his own expression. The only difference was where their gazes were focused. Ino was all too used to the looks her body drew, but Enko had told her that that was one of the greatest assets of a kunoichi, and to not be afraid to use it to her advantage. Several more seconds lapsed before she leaned forward slightly and said, "So, we know you have accomplices. If you talk now, maybe we can do something for you." Silence, not that Ino expected anything more. That was fine though, she didn't need words to get the answers she was looking for. "You know we'll find them, right?" she continued. A brief quirk of his lips, a flicker of arrogance. "Aha. Konoha has pretty tight security. There can't be more than, 2, 3 of you, tops." Movement in the cheek, signifying grinding of the teeth. "Only 2 others then." She laced her fingers together and placed her chin upon them. "Your job was to infiltrate our intelligence division. It's not too hard to guess that your accomplices are in different departments to further cripple us. Logistics? Cryptanalysis." A slight wrinkle of the upper lip, the beginning of a sneer. "Medical research, analytics, defense?" Another tick. "Gotcha." A knock on the door interrupted her next line of questioning. Ino turned to see Ibiki standing in the doorway to the interrogation room. She rose and walked past him. When he shut the door, she turned to face him with crossed arms. Ibiki raised an eyebrow at her. "Any luck?" "He's got 2 accomplices, one in cryptanalysis and one in defense," she replied. "Given their placement, I think they're trying to sabotage our intel in preparation for an invasion, but why a small village like Amigakure would be interested in attacking us is beyond me. Do they even have the forces?" "Unlikely," Ibiki mused. "Then again, AIM's been such a black hole of information in recent years that it's anybody's guess what Hanzo's been up to." Their footsteps echoed loudly in the flagstone hallway as they walked away from the prisoner's cell. "Your help is appreciated. Just doing my job. If they all have the same traps in their minds that you said this guy does, it'll be difficult to root them out. We'll figure something out. Hopefully. Anyway, I should be going. Let me know if you need anything else." LLL. The tall canopy, the lush foliage, the feel of hundreds of people ambling along, going about their drudgery, how he missed Konoha. Sure, he'd skirted through the edge of the Land of Fire in his more recent travels. It was hard not to, with how big the country was and its location on the continent, but it had been a long time since he'd dared to venture this close to the Hidden Leaf. It wasn't out of fear. Zetsu didn't really fear anything, considering the powers at his disposal and the inevitable futility of those few who came into contact with him. But with the grudging respect he'd developed for Naruto over the years of their companionship came a strange inkling to retain a distance from the blonde's former home. If Naruto didn't want to know what was occurring in his absence, who was Zetsu to dispute that? The former Konohanin had taken Zetsu's ideologies and warped them to fit his own worldview. Zetsu didn't necessarily agree with all the conclusions his pupil had drawn, or even the decisions he'd made, but then again, he didn't have to. That was the beauty of experiential philosophy and adaptation. It was the primary reason the plant man didn't keep Naruto apprised of anything he found out in the real world that the blonde could find out on his own. Now that he was independent, it was up to him to fend for himself. And if the last 5 years were any indication, he was achieving that goal admirably. It was more regimented, boring, white Zetsu liked to tell the blonde, than the former grass shinobi preferred, but again, that just showed how 2 individuals with the same core ideology could branch off into different sects. Where Naruto liked to have plans and goals to keep himself safe, Zetsu didn't mind giving in to chaos and spontaneity. Which was probably why, despite his respect for the blonde's relationship, or lack thereof, with his former home, the plant man found himself back at the Hidden Leaf's outskirts. The temptation to be there was just too much fun. Doesn't seem like much has changed. Did you expect it to? If you lose a part, it's just replaced with another. But Naruto-kun was such a special part. I didn't say the efficiency was retained. I guess that's true. He paused, head tilting to one side as if trying to hear something in greater detail. Off in the distance was a muted wisp of chakra, barely noticeable amidst the cacophony of shinobi in the village, yet with a vague familiarity that made it stand out like a beacon. How peculiar. Is that Naruto-kun? Not unless something has drastically changed since we last met. His 2 halves in unspoken agreement, Zetsu sank into the Land of Fire's root system with the mayfly technique, homing in on the location where the chakra source was originating. When he eventually surfaced, concealed within the depths of an oak trunk, it was across from a school playground. Children, too small to even be considered a morsel to the plant man's palate, were being led outside by a handful of adults to be sent off with individual adults, parents picking up their kids, he assumed, judging by the similarities in the chakra signatures. Yellow eyes affixed themselves on the chakra signature which had garnered his attention, the Nukanen's normal eye widening in disbelief. Well, this is unexpected. What should we do? Isn't it obvious? I guess you're right. As he slipped back through the foliage and moved away, Black Zetsu couldn't help but add, if nothing else, the fallout should be quite entertaining. LLL. Masao-kun, do you have my? Right here, Maki-san. Maki Kimiko, hunched octogenarian, reached for the jar the strawberry blonde was holding out to her and tucked it within the folds of her yukata. She smiled at Masao, the crow's feet around her eyes crinkling. I told you to call me Kimiko-san, Masao-kun. You're the only one who's ever made me medicine which actually works, after all. I think you've earned it. Masao bowed to her. It's what I do, Kimiko-san. And you're sure you can't tell me? Masao straightened and winked at her with one crystal blue eye. Trade secret, sorry. I've gotta stay in business somehow. Kimiko's smile grew a little wider. Can't blame an old woman for trying. Here, she continued, holding out 200 ryo for Masao to take. I can't believe you stay in business with such low prices. Low overhead and lots of repeat customers, replied the strawberry blonde with a grin. It was how all their exchanges ended since Kimiko had first returned for more medication over 2 years ago, thrilled to find a pain reliever that worked. Until next time, Kimiko-san, he offered as she limped towards the door, cane thumping against the wooden floor. He heaved a small sigh as the door closed behind her, though his lips carried an amused smirk. Sometime over the last couple of years, he'd actually managed to build a rapport with a strong clientele who loved his products, and the strangeness of that phenomenon had never quite left. Of course, it helped that his medicines were some of the best on the market, and at prices that severely undercut any competitors. What he'd told Kimiko was true, after all, and hardly replicable by others. After locking the main door, he headed to the back room, where 3 heads of short blonde hair were hard at work on various tasks. Hidden from sight in the back, Naruto's shadow clones didn't need to disguise themselves from the prying eyes of the general public. He pulled the mixture of berry dyes from his hair, returning it to its natural color, and stoppered it in a small vial. With minimal applications of natural energy, he'd found he could strengthen or weaken different natural dyes and change his hair color at a whim, useful for blending in without relying on a henge. Done? All 3 clones turned around and tossed him lazy salutes with mocking grins. Yeah boss, they chorused before dispersing. Naruto went around and finished cleaning up their workstations, putting the different products they'd been working on away. Between using replicas of himself as employees and either finding all his ingredients in nature or growing them himself, the shop was a great, simple business. And given that the land of grass was famous for its plant-based products, living in Katori, the country's second largest city, behind Kusagakure proper, was essentially hiding in plain sight. Not that he wasn't careful. An array of drugged spies in foreign countries kept him apprised of changes to the continental status quo, while a network of plants he carefully maintained allowed him to remain wary of any threats on his home turf. He unlocked the door to the loft above his shop and stepped in, taking a deep breath and letting the scent of fresh herbs wash over him. Even after years of getting used to the smell, nothing soothed him quite as much as the green life in his loft. Tendrils from hanging plants drooped around him like beaded curtains, and Naruto touched them as he entered, drawing strength from their nearness. He moved into the kitchen and set a kettle to boil, musing what he should make for dinner. Thwip thwip. That was close. Every time? Really? Naruto failed to hide the grin that formed, shooting a furtive glance at the small cactus sitting on his coffee table. With much manipulation, he'd raised the plant to recognize Zetsu's specific chakra signature and shoot out spines wherever the renegade popped up. It was always vindicating when the former Kusanin's attempts to surprise him were foiled, and Naruto liked knowing that he'd one-upped his tutor in some form. If you'd knock like a normal person, he suggested. Normal is overrated. Is it safe now? The blonde beckoned for his tutor to fully appear, watching as the plant man finished melding out of the floor as far from the offending cactus as possible. Both yellow eyes were fixated on the small plant, white Zetsu's half-mouth turned down in a frown. Neither side seemed to appreciate that Naruto had more control than him over even one plant. So, he said, picking out a blend of tea leaves and putting them in a cup, to what do I owe the pleasure, I guess? Oh, the pleasure is all ours this time. Ooh, can I tell him? Pretty please? Naruto scowled suspiciously at his mentor, hands clenching the countertop. Black Zetsu's mocking sounded far too pleased, and White Zetsu was too eager to divulge whatever information he had. On their own, that was troubling. Together? Shit. Tell me what? You have a son. White Zetsu blurted. Naruto felt his fingers go slack, his body seemingly disconnected from his brain. Blankly, he managed, I what? You're a father. Congratulations. Yes, congratulations on this wondrous accomplishment. He ignored Black Zetsu's dry insincerity, grappling for a semblance of common sense to latch onto. But I don't even, where? How? Well, drawled White Zetsu, we were visiting Konoha. Konoha? Ino. He realized. She got pregnant from that one time? Unfucking believable. Hey, you're interrupting my story. Now it was White Zetsu's puffed cheeks and pouty expression which went ignored, blue eyes focusing on Black Zetsu's unblinking yellow one. You're not just screwing with me, are you? As much fun as that would be, the truth is much better. Naruto watched him for a long moment, scrutinizing his mentor, before demanding, take me there. LLL. The surrounding foliage gave Naruto a sense of power that he felt he was sorely lacking at the moment. Or maybe it wasn't power he was lacking, but simply control. With everything going his way recently, he was so used to having his plans executed correctly that this new wrench felt like a shock to a dead system. When was the last time he'd been so blindsided by something, or been forced to improvise? Too long, apparently, answered his cynical mind. After traveling for nearly a day in absolute silence, Naruto wasn't sure whether to consider the voice in his head a good thing or not. Instead, he turned to his traveling companion. So, how'd you actually find out I have a son? Damn, that would take time to sink in. You mean, aside from the obvious physical resemblance, came the sarcastic reply. We sensed it in your chakra signatures. You what? Black Zetsu exuded a long-suffering sigh. Every person's chakra is unique. It's based on several properties, one of which is elemental affiliation. Another component is genetic, and parents tend to pass on elements of their chakra to their children. Exceptional sensor-type shinobi, like us, can parse out each person's unique chakra signatures, whereas the more common sensing techniques can only sense chakra presence. Since your son's chakra includes aspects of your own, with which we are quite familiar, it was easy to determine that he was your spawn. More common sensing techniques, Naruto thought dryly. Feels like I'm being called out. But Zetsu's enhanced sensing abilities made his task tricky. As good as the natural energy-enhanced version of the green sight technique was, its main use was in determining what chakra didn't belong to the green world. It couldn't parse out the unique aspects of chakra signatures like the rogue Kusanine could, which meant Naruto had to confirm his tutor's tale the hard way. And getting close to Konoha for the first time in 5 years in order to see his son was rather discomfiting. We're near. Naruto shook himself from his stupor and summoned natural energy to himself, sharpening his senses. He turned his head slightly to the west. There's a lot of people over there. Don't worry, Naruto-kun, they're just kids. Hardly a threat. His goal isn't to kill them, idiot. Then why's he so scared? The unknown, most likely. Zetsu, either help me or shut up, the blonde groused. Testy, but fine. Everyone's outside, probably for a break. Your son is there, noted Black Zetsu, pointing slightly at an angle to Naruto's line of sight. Can't miss him. The Jinchuriki took a tentative, robotic step in the direction his mentor was indicating just as White Zetsu cheerfully added, good luck. Naruto's feet were leaden as he took measured steps forward. His mind felt clouded, every thought and pathway which normally cycled over on repeat surrounded by fog. After several moments, a pinprick of rationality pierced the veil around his brain, and he slipped all but his head into the ground with the attack prevention technique, moving automatically through the earth until the trees thinned ahead. He stopped at the edge of the tree line when a clear view of the area ahead presented itself. Hidden in the bushes, he peered out at a playground, watching about a dozen frolicking 4- and 5-year-olds overseen by several adults, teachers, he guessed, probably some sort of preschool. It took him mere seconds to identify his son, a strange ache building in his throat as blue eyes fell upon him. The boy had the same crown of unruly, spiky yellow hair that had adorned his own head as a child, a trait apparently unique to him. From a distance, it was too hard to tell eye color, or whether he shared any of Naruto's other features, but there was something so nostalgic about the hair alone that the runaway Jonin knew Zetsu hadn't misled him. The key difference, it seemed, was that his son had peers willing to play with him. An unbidden pang of envy welled inside him at the sight, and Naruto tried to quash it by reminding himself that neither the boy nor his companions were the cause of his own childhood sadness, and that his son's situation wasn't a reflection of his own. Although, he supposed, as he watched the teachers round up the children and herd them back into the building behind them, it was similar in one regard, an absent father. Maybe that can be fixed, he thought as he sank completely into the earth and returned to where he'd left Zetsu. Even as he tried to quickly debate the pros and cons of such an idea, Naruto knew it was insane and stupid from the get-go, a point his mentor had no issue vocalizing when he brought it up and reluctantly asked for the plant man's assistance. And if your inane scheme works, how do you intend on managing such a life? Black Zetsu mocked. Yeah, you're not gonna stay in Konoha, are you? White Zetsu added. Naruto hesitated before slowly admitting, I don't know. But I think this is something I need to try anyway. So be it. It's your funeral. She's at home alone right now, about half a mile that way, he said, pointing to the east. She lives above the flower shop you used to work at. That was fast. Well, wish me luck. Good luck. White Zetsu offered. Idiot, don't sound so sincere, Black Zetsu chided his other half. Just before the blonde finished melding into the ground, Naruto heard his mentor snipe, have fun ruining your life. LLL. Ino whipped around as she picked up on the presence of another chakra signature in her house. As her sensing abilities had expanded in the past several years, she'd been able to memorize the chakra of the people she interacted with frequently. But this one, suddenly appearing out of nowhere and sharing some similarities with her son's? Dashing out of her room and into the living room, Ino stared in shock at the sight before her. Naruto was melding out of the floor not 20 feet before her, his feet rising from the heart-achingly familiar attack prevention technique. He looked more mature than she remembered, with short blonde hair and more weathered skin, though it didn't seem like his clothing choices, light brown pants and a forest green hoodie with wrist-length open sleeves, had changed all that much. She blinked twice, as if to ascertain what she was seeing wasn't an illusion. Naruto? He raised a hand in greeting. Hey Ino. The platinum blonde raced across the room and threw her arms around his neck, embracing him tightly. You're alive, she whispered. Holy shit, I can't believe it. Then she released him and took a step back, her tone getting louder and more indignant. Where have you been? Well, Jiraiya sent me undercover on a long-term mission, and I'm finally. Ino? There was now several feet of distance between the two blondes. Ino's lips were contorted in a deep frown. I've been working in TNI since before you disappeared, she began, a sharp lick of acid tinging her words. In that time, I've learned every tell in the book about when someone isn't telling the truth, and I know that you're lying to me. So I'll ask again, where, the hell, were you? TNI? Naruto thought, blue eyes pensive. If she'd really started an apprenticeship in the torture and interrogation department as he'd been getting close to leaving Konoha, her sudden coyness about her future goals made a lot more sense. Ino's growth during his absence was probably nothing to sneeze at then, so glad to see him, the younger Ino wouldn't have even questioned Naruto's answer. This complicates things. He'd expected some resistance from his fellow blonde, but her intuitiveness was better than he remembered, or expected. Crystal blue eyes hardened to meet the steely gaze Ino was leveraging at him. He was now on the defensive and had nothing to lose by going all in. If she wants the truth so badly, fine. I left, he stated simply, choosing not to get into the specifics of where he'd been. It probably didn't matter where he was so much as why he hadn't been in the Hidden Leaf. And why was that? Because I needed to be free of all this, he said, gesturing broadly. There wasn't anything here for me, and wasn't anything here for you? Ino echoed dangerously. What, so our friendship meant nothing to you? Our date, us sleeping together, were you just using me? Naruto resisted the familiar urge to scratch the side of his head, unsure of how to respond. Being around Ino again made him feel like a teenager. And he apparently couldn't lie without being caught, so? Kinda, but. There was a powerful sound of skin on skin as Ino's palm connected with Naruto's cheek. Bastard, Ino seethed, baby blue eyes narrowed in fury. Yeah, I probably deserved that. I didn't force you to have sex with me, he told her calmly, and I never asked for you to like me romantically. You were my best friend, he continued in a soft voice, hoping it would soothe her, and I appreciated that friendship, but I made up my mind to leave way before we became that close. Then why'd you come back, Naruto? Why shouldn't I tell someone that you're back, alive, right now? The hostility remaining in her voice indicated that his hope was likely to go unfounded. He took a deep breath, prayed for the best, and admitted, I just found out about our son, and no way in hell. I want to meet him, Naruto finished. Ino let out a cynical bark of laughter. You think I'm just going to let you, walk in here and take my son away? Fat chance. Doesn't it say something that I came back? You shouldn't have left in the first place, Ino snapped. Naruto let out a growl of frustration. Playing nice didn't seem to be doing anything in the face of his former teammate's wrath, which he'd severely underestimated. How much had changed over the past 5 years? Will you let it go? What's done is done, I can't change the past. Besides, I had to leave. Why? Because living here sucked, he shouted. Ino took a step backwards, surprised at his sudden raised voice. Look, he continued, fighting the urge to throw his fist through a wall, maybe I had you and Tenten and Jiraiya, Shikamaru, Choji, Asuma, Shizun, but it was too late by then, okay? I stopped caring about people respecting me or whatever, but to hate me for something I had no control over. I didn't want to get stuck working for and protecting people who just didn't care. I cared, Ino replied in a more normal voice. So did Tenten, and everyone else you mentioned. Was that not enough for you? Naruto hesitated before responding. Truth be told, he'd had much the same thought as his exit from Konoha had drawn nearer, finding the companionship of his friends, few though they were, a comforting presence, even in the face of everyone else's disdain. And there had been temptation in that. But the allure of a plan years in the making, his bid for freedom, had won out, and so he'd pushed the thought out of his mind so he could live his life without that regret, even if he had others. I don't expect you to understand, he answered. It seemed better to avoid the question, as Ino was likely to follow it down a path that just raised her ire and worked against him. I don't think anyone really understands anyone else unless they've lived through the same experiences. I'm asking for you to trust me. Another bark of laughter, this one skeptical. Trust you? You've changed so much. No, Naruto admitted, I'm just more honest about who I was back then. Who you are is a selfish asshole, Ino growled. And I'll be damned if I let you near my son. He's my son, too, returned the blonde irately, and if you think keeping me a secret from him is a good idea, then you're wrong. The Yamanaka scoffed. I think I know more about what's good for him than you do. Really? Because of the two of us, I'm the only one who knows what it's like to grow up without a father. And if you think that didn't play a part in how I turned out, you're sadly mistaken. Maybe I grew up with a father, Ino began icily, words measured and poisonous, but I know what it's like to lose one. He died looking for you, she seethed at the blonde's surprised expression, so if you think trying to play the orphan card is going to win you any favors, then you're sadly mistaken. Something that felt awfully like shame welled up inside Naruto at that revelation. When he'd left Konoha, he'd thought that the repercussions of his departure would be minimal at best. He hadn't counted on Ino getting pregnant or her father dying on a mission trying to bring him back. What else had happened that he hadn't accounted for? I'm sorry, he conceded, tone conciliatory. I didn't know. I didn't plan for any of this. When Ino scoffed again, Naruto had the grace to look away in defeat. Look, I get that you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. But I would like to meet my son. Here, he said, flicking the platinum blonde a small seed. Take a couple days to think about it. When you're ready to talk, channel your chakra into that. And what's to prevent me from reporting you to the Hokage or setting a trap? Naruto shrugged. Nothing. But I'll know. And I guarantee you'll never hear from me again. With that said, he sank out of sight and left the village proper. LLL. It had been a long time since he'd felt anything remotely approaching guilt. Perhaps when he'd left aka at the mercy of Kisame? But even then, he'd had no personal connection with the redhead, and certainly nothing on the level of what he was currently feeling. The fact that he was still bothered by it days later was aggravating. He needed an outlet. Fortunately, there was a group of 20 bandits who had set up camp about 50 miles outside of Konoha. Naruto had come across them not long after leaving Ino in an attempt to find a place to hunker down while he waited for her to make a decision. He'd watched them with vacant eyes, more for a lack of anything better to do, while his mind replayed his conversation with Ino and tried to pinpoint his missteps. But it seemed like the entire exchange had been riddled with them. Ino wasn't the person he'd expected her to be, and his gamble had been based on the teenage girl from his memory, not the shrewd, skeptical mother she'd grown into. For all the information he had on other villages, there was a gaping hole in his network when it came to Konoha. In trying to avoid his former home, he'd made himself ignorant of its progress, and now that decision, or fear, was biting him in the ass. Hard. And now he had to decide between the danger of continuing to remain ignorant, or risk exposing himself by turning a Konohanin into an informant. He heaved a long, mental sigh. I left Konoha so I wouldn't have to deal with all this complex shit. The sun was starting to set, and from his perch high in the canopy, the darkening golden oranges and yellows seemed to highlight the downward spiral of his mood. He really needed that outlet. Naruto jumped from the tree and summoned enough wind to cushion his fall as he plummeted through the air. He hit the ground with a resounding thud, dust billowing out from the point of impact. Shouts echoed out around him, confused voices searching for answers to what was going on. He dug into the pouch at his waist with both hands and came out with Sanban clenched between his fingers. They flew through the air, and Naruto was rewarded by several yelps and hisses as the needles struck true. He propelled himself forward, bursting through the dusty smokescreen and summoning a trickle of natural energy from his surroundings. The shafts of bamboo he had hidden under his sleeves grew longer, extending a foot over his knuckles. He slashed at the bandit before him, carving a bloody X across the man's chest with plants as sharp as knives. Senpo, Kusanagi. The bandit fell back silently, blood spewing from his corpse. He sidestepped the weighted end of a kusarigama that sailed through the air, wrapping the bamboo from his left hand into the chain and pulling towards him. Whoever was on the other end was pulled forward, and Naruto plunged his right side bamboo into the man's stomach. Senpo, Sashiki no Jutsu. Extra bamboo branches exploded from the man's body in a rain of blood. Naruto jerked his wrist to break off the bamboo, then grabbed the broken piece and flung it to the side. It buried itself in another man's thigh before sprouting into another sage art, cutting technique. Dusk was fading into night, and Naruto could feel even the limited natural energy he was using weaken. He broke off the other bamboo piece to prevent any interference with his hands and then immediately began flipping through seals, holding his palms out on either side of his body. Futon, Shinku Hiki. Cries of outrage sounded as the vacuum pull technique took effect. Naruto increased the pull of the wind from the jutsu center, bringing the remaining 10 bandits into sight. When they were close enough, he stopped the technique, throwing the men momentarily off balance, and placed his hands together. Then he opened his mouth and exhaled a cloud of poisonous smoke, turning on his heels to spin 360 degrees. Within moments, the blonde was surrounded by coughing, wheezing men. A few more seconds, and he was the only human left breathing in the camp. He glanced around at his handiwork before muttering, "Gotta love the classics." Then he exhaled, a long sound of relief. That's a bit better. A sudden jolt rocked his body, like an electric current, though the sensation only lasted a second, and just like that, his good mood evaporated. He grunted. Guess she wants to talk. Finally. Well, no point in leaving a mess behind. With a few quick seals, the soil around him turned to mud, the swamp of the underworld swallowing any evidence of his deeds. He gave the area one last scan before disappearing into the ground and hightailing it towards the village. Instead of going back to Ino's home, he veered off and resurfaced in the dark familiarity of the forest where he'd always met Zetsu. Fortunately, the plant man was nowhere to be found. Now that he thought about it, his mentor hadn't bothered him since he'd gone to visit Ino. Annoyingly, he could still sense the renegade Kusanine lurking around the hidden leaf, likely judging the blonde's decisions from afar. Prick. Shoving thoughts of his two-tone tutor to the back of his mind, Naruto focused on the speck of chakra in the seed he'd given Ino. Similar to how he'd trained his small cactus to recognize Zetsu's signature, he'd also managed to grow a miniature tree with seeds imbued with his own chakra. The seeds were capable of acting as a beacon of sorts. Once given to another person, Naruto could either be notified of a desire to meet with a brief application of chakra, or search for and summon people to him by linking the chakra in the seed to his body. Ino had alerted him she was ready to talk, now he would guide her towards him. It took longer than he thought it would for her to appear, though he chalked that up to her lingering skepticism and resentment towards him. Naruto, she greeted stonily. Ino. You rang? She made a noncommittal hum. Neat trick with the seed. I think so. The silence that spanned between them was so long and painful that Naruto briefly wondered if their former friendship had just been a figment of his imagination. So, did you come to a decision? Ino crossed her arms over her chest. That all depends on you. I've thought about it, and you have a point. People can't truly understand one another unless they've lived through the same experiences, and I don't know what you've been through. But things are different between us now, and I don't trust you anymore, especially with my son. So, since you're asking for something big from me, I want something big from you. Naruto arched an eyebrow. Like? The Psycho Denshin. A tremor of something akin to fear ran through the blonde's body. Even though all the Yamanaka clan techniques involved telepathy on some level, the holding door mind transmission, which Ino had told him she was starting to learn around the time of his departure, was the quickest and most effective form of mind reading in Konoha, and likely the continent. It would essentially put all his memories on display for her, like flipping through a photo album or watching a movie. Silence rang between them as Ino studied him with analytical blue eyes. He was beyond hesitant to allow his former friend anywhere near his memories, and rightfully so. There was no telling what she could or would do to his mind while she was probing it. But he'd already lost significant traction in his byplay with the Yamanaka, and now he was stuck playing her game instead of his. So the real question became, was there truly anything more to lose going forward? He'd already exposed his existence to Ino, and the one thread of biology he'd discovered, not even a distant cousin, but his own child, was a few steps away. All that stood between them were a few self-imposed obstacles, rules he followed for the sake of his own sanity. But his actions over the past few days had resulted in a shredded rulebook and windblown scraps of paper, all for the sake of something with no guarantee of success. He could practically hear Zetsu telling him that the best things in life carried risk. Slowly, with careful consideration, the blonde nodded his consent. Ino took cautious steps forward, as if approaching an animal which could harm her at any moment, and reached out to place one hand upon his forehead. Her fingers wisped through his short yellow spikes. "This won't hurt," she assured him. Then she closed her eyes and concentrated, and suddenly Naruto could see images flashing before his mind's eye, a long scroll with his life story inscribed upon it unraveling at her fingertips. It was bizarre, he supposed, to see his memories laid out and replayed in his mind, especially when Ino seemed to grab and hold on to some moments more than others. Years prior, when he'd meet with Zetsu to discuss some facet of social or shinobi philosophy, there had been times when he'd struggled to make connections to his own life, mostly because the memories had become diluted and scrambled with age. But now, with Ino flipping through his formative years, Naruto could remember why he'd become as jaded and withdrawn as he had. Each transgression he'd suffered, long scabbed over, seemed to bleed anew, even as the sting of each wound merely throbbed dully with age. The minute Ino stumbled upon his first meeting with Zetsu, the platinum blonde shrieked in surprise and withdrew her hand from his forehead, baby blue eyes wide in a mixture of shock and horror. What the hell was that? Naruto heaved a tired sigh, even though he'd known the question was likely to come up when he'd agreed to the Psycho Denshin. Trying to explain the plant man was bound to be problematic. "That's Zetsu. You could say he's my mentor." "Your mentor?" Ino echoed incredulously. "It tried to kill you. And you decided to learn from it?" "I told you I don't expect you to understand why I did what I did," he stated, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you don't want to continue." "I'm over it," she asserted, though the Jinchuriki felt that she was trying to convince herself more than anything. Not that he blamed her, it took a lot to stomach Zetsu. When her hand fell back to his forehead, he could feel it shaking, just a little. This time, the images came slower, Ino watching and analyzing each one in turn. He watched with her as his precision and accuracy grew slowly under Zetsu's yellow-eyed gaze, his unsureness in the revelation of his status as the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, their meeting in the flower shop and potential friendship, interacting with Team 7, walks through the forest with Zetsu as he learned about botany, poisons, and medicinal herbs, the mission in the Land of Waves, his failure in the Chunin exams. At the point where Naruto started to learn the Shinra Bancho, Ino lowered her hand again, her lips were pursed, and a frown pinched her brow together. "You listened to it. Why?" "Because, he made good points. It turned you against Konoha." Ino shouted, baby blue eyes narrowed in anger. "Konoha turned me against Konoha," Naruto corrected firmly. His own blue eyes reflected a surety that he knew exactly what he was talking about. "You trusted that freak of nature over your village." Naruto stopped her by grabbing her wrist and placing her hand upon his forehead. "Go back in," he ordered quietly. "Go back in, rewatch everything, and then tell me that Zetsu manipulated me into leaving." Ino stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand his thoughts without actually reading his mind. Naruto didn't blame her skepticism. He'd gone from hesitant to allow her inside his memories to telling her to essentially psychoanalyze him. Now, suddenly, he wanted her to understand him, even if he wasn't sure she could. When the Yamanaka did as he requested, the previous memories began to replay, but this time they moved in something closer to real time. Instead of skimming them for fragments of importance, Ino was analyzing them for clues. Both blondes relived what felt like every word exchanged between Zetsu and a young Naruto over the course of months, up to the point where Ino had returned from the Forest of Death to a Naruto fed up with her idolization of Sasuke. Then, after reviewing all that, some memories twice, just to scrutinize them for every minute detail, Ino went back to his formative years and started sifting through those again. Naruto considered it a good sign. Every step he'd taken towards leaving Konoha had been prefaced by a specific instance he could point to in his past that drove him away from the hidden leaf. But Ino hadn't been privy to any of that, and couldn't see his thoughts as he'd had them back then, and was now looking for evidence to support why he'd made the decisions he had. It took a while to get through his childhood, but apparently Ino found what she was looking for the memories sped back up until they'd returned to where she'd left off. This time, she didn't slow down unless something caught her interest, his first conversation with Gaara, knocking the Sunanin out during the sand/sound invasion, his reaction to her pretending to flirt with him. Things progressed in that vein as the platinum blonde sifted through years of training and missions and botanical experiments, up until the night before Naruto left the hidden leaf. There, she slowed down the memory and watched every action for something. What it was, Naruto didn't know, but the same shadow of doubt he'd felt back then was now stuck in his chest, a thick mass of guilt as their date replayed itself before his eyes. He had used Ino for his own purposes, and she'd been left behind to deal with the repercussions while he'd gone off and lived a life he'd spent years building up in his head. And while his life now was great, it hadn't been his intention to screw over his closest friend in the process. Hindsight gave the gift of clarity, he supposed. His confession to Ino the morning following their date surfaced, and the memory seemed to pause, perhaps reflecting the Yamanaka's confusion, before playing in its entirety. When it was done, Ino withdrew her hand from his forehead and simply stood motionless, a pensive yet sad expression on her face. You said your mentor brainwashed you, but it never specifically told you had to abandon Konoha, did it? Naruto shrugged. Kinda, but not really? It's hard to explain. He just kind of guided me there when I figured out I needed a new path. I left because, well, probably for the same reason you keep calling Zetsu it. People here saw me as a reminder of what they'd lost when the Kyuubi attacked rather than as me, a human. After realizing that, I figured it didn't make sense to stay where I wasn't gonna be appreciated, where I was gonna be used for what I was rather than who I was. Yeah, I saw. Sorry, she apologized, though it seemed more automatic than sincere, and Naruto wasn't sure whether or not she was referring to how he was treated growing up or her dehumanization of his tutor. But you seemed happy when we were teenagers. Well, yeah, I guess. We had fun, and I liked training and hanging out with you and Tenten and the others. But the idea of protecting all these other people who couldn't stand me, who lied to me, I couldn't stay here. I didn't feel free back then, but now I do. Ino lapsed into another thoughtful silence before probing, what you said, after we slept together. Did you mean it? Yeah, Naruto admitted, of course. You were my first and closest friend, and our friendship was the best part of being here. And I'm sorry about how things turned out, but, he continued, tone unyielding, I'm not coming back to Konoha. Ino hummed in thought for a moment, and when she finally spoke, her tone was businesslike. No, I imagine not. Whatever spell that had fallen between them during the Psycho Denshin was broken, a détente waffling among hostility, stubbornness, and nostalgia taking root. After several moments of careful thought, she said, I think I get why you did what you did, but we're not who we were back then, and I still can't fully trust you. So, it was all for nothing then. But, she continued, I understand the influence a parent has on their child. And I want the best for Inogen. So I'll let you meet him. Or not. With certain conditions. Naruto frowned. Ah. Of course it wouldn't be that simple. What are they? I'll be supervising whenever you two are together. I'll have to lock away his memories each time. Why? Because he's 4, Ino deadpanned, and if you want your existence to remain a secret, he can't remember you're alive when you're not together. And, you're okay with that? No, she snapped. I don't like lying to my son, or manipulating his mind. But if that's what I have to do to make this work, then I will. Ino was making a huge sacrifice for him, Naruto realized. He'd known when he'd confronted her that the two likeliest outcomes were that he'd have to keep her quiet in some way or be forced to leave the continent to avoid Konoha's search parties. But it hadn't occurred to him the toll it might take on her if she actually agreed to his proposal, for as plan-oriented as he tried to be, he could also be remarkably short-sighted. Everything in her face screamed at him that her decision was heart-wrenching. Thank you, he murmured. I'm not done. You also owe me. I don't care about your self-reliant crap, she cut across his protest. You're asking me to go against my better judgment, including treason for consorting with a nuke Nin, so I'm asking the same of you. Fair enough. What do you want? Information. I want to know anything you've found out about the other villages that might remotely affect Konoha. Naruto hesitated. When he'd left the Hidden Leaf, it was specifically because he didn't want to work for a village that didn't appreciate him, that we wouldn't become a tool. That he was being suckered back into assisting the village he'd abandoned was a mockery of the life he'd fought tooth and nail to achieve, not to mention becoming a puppet rather than the one pulling the strings. But he was so close to meeting his son. And even though it had been years since they'd been close, and she'd changed more than he'd expected, there was still a tiny part of him that trusted Ino. Maybe it was leftover nostalgia from the Psycho Denshin, or maybe just a shred of the empathy he'd tried desperately to expunge, but it was there regardless. She was making a huge concession to make this work for him, and she at least understood his story, meaning some piece of the blonde he remembered still remained. The memory of the girl in the forest, long forgotten, now echoed in his mind, asking the question he'd answered with a lie. Do you have someone who is important to you? Someone important to you, a precious person who you would do anything for. For years now, it had only been him, but with the knowledge that there was someone out there biologically connected to him, maybe that could change. Maybe he could change, just a little. For the friendship that lingered, and for his self-indulgence, he was willing to compromise. Naruto slowly nodded. Done. Chapter 26, Rules and Cheats. When the rules impede your progress, do you live within the confines of them, or do you seek a path to break them? LLL. Mommy, why are we out here? It's a surprise. You like surprises, right? Yeah. 20 feet above them, Naruto watched the exchange from the branch of an oak tree. Ino seemed every bit the doting mother, walking with Inogen's right hand clasped with her left, head tilting subtly and eyes shifting furtively to check the surroundings for any impending danger. From his own sweep, Naruto already knew the area was clear, but he could appreciate her paranoia. Whether it was caused more by him or being caught by some Konohanin, the blonde didn't know, but the fact that she'd even showed up amazed him on its own. Over the past couple days, he'd been waiting for her to renege on their deal in some fashion, whether by simply not following through or by sending Leaf Shinobi to find him. But here she was, nary another Konohanin in sight, in spite of all her misgivings about him. Well, here goes nothing. He dropped off the branch, landing in some fallen leaves with a crunch. Inogen visibly flinched at his appearance, though he shook it off with a breathy, "Woa." "Inogen," Ino began with forced geniality, "this is your father." His son's blue eyes, inherited from his mother, went so wide the Jinchuriki found it almost comical. "Really? Really?" Naruto kneeled to make eye contact with his son, smiling gently at the boy. "Hey! How come you've been gone?" Naruto winced at the question, laced with enough innocence and a tinge of melancholy that he couldn't help but feel a pang of remorse for his decision. He's been watching over Konoha from afar," Ino interjected. "Your father is an important, powerful shinobi." Inogen's eyes were once again alight with admiration. Naruto shot his fellow blonde a grateful look, starting slightly when her stiff, "You're welcome," filled his head. "Telepathy?" he wondered, before turning his attention back to his son. "Yeah. Top secret stuff." "Wanna see something cool?" he prompted before the boy could ask any other awkward questions. When Inogen nodded so vigorously that the Jinchuriki expected his head to wobble off, Naruto pulled a tiny seed from his pocket and held it up for his son to see. "See this? Okay, now watch." He walked 10 feet away and then used his thumb to create a small divot in the loose dirt before placing the seed in it, covering it, and gently tamping it down. Then, with one hand palm down to the earth, he summoned the forest's natural energy to him, breathing in the odor of woody foliage as his senses sharpened. He allowed that power to flow through him and into the seed, filling it with the growth of its brethren. A sprout appeared slowly, unfurling from the earth like a sleeper rising from bed. He heard Inogen release an odd exhale from beside him, and with his heightened awareness, sensed even Ino taking a curious step forward, seeking a better vantage point. When the fledgling tree had reached a mere 3 feet in height, Naruto stopped channeling natural energy and allowed the newborn plant to fall into its natural growth cycle. "Cool." Naruto grinned to himself, suddenly proud for seemingly no reason he could name, before turning to face his son. "Right? Everyone starts small, but given time, even something small can turn into something big. One day, this little guy will look like that," he finished, thumbing in turn towards the tree he'd grown and then a 150-foot kapok tree nearby. "I told you your father's powerful," Ino commented. "He can grow trees. Do you know who else could do that?" Inogen's brow furrowed together in thought, and the expression was so familiar that Naruto had to force himself to stifle his amused chuckle. "The Shodai," he finally declared. "That's right. You're pretty smart, huh?" Naruto posed. "I would not have known that at your age. He's definitely a quicker study than you." "Not that that's saying much," Ino added telepathically. Naruto shot her a half-grin. It felt a little like old times, with Ino's sass having a more playful than biting edge to it. Returning his attention to Inogen, he asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A shinobi," he proclaimed. "Like you and mommy." "Oh yeah? You know what the most important part of being a shinobi is?" "Naruto," Ino warned, the edge back in her mental voice. The younger blonde seemed to give it a moment of thought, shaking his head when he ultimately concluded that he didn't. "It's to find your own path," Naruto answered, tousling his son's already messy hair and earning a laugh in response. A smile stretched unbidden across his lips at how much joy that simple gesture brought the boy. "Just be true to who you are." Rising to his feet, he continued, "Maybe one day you'll be as strong as me. Then no one can tell you what to do, not even your mom," he whispered conspiratorially. "Okay. All right, Inogen, I need to talk to your father before he leaves." Naruto almost protested that he didn't have anywhere to be, but Ino's tone and body language stayed his tongue. "Say goodbye." Okay." Small arms wrapped tight around Naruto's legs, and the Jinchuriki felt a semi-familiar pang in his chest. "Bye, Daddy." Then Inogen looked up at him with wide, baby blue eyes. "Will you come back?" Naruto could feel a second, more piercing, set of blue eyes watching him, scrutinizing his pending answer, as if daring him to disappoint their child. And for once, the blonde felt that he understood what it meant to truly care about something, or someone, other than himself. Where he was jaded and selfish, where Ino was judgmental and overbearing, Inogen was innocence and naivete epitomized. He held no enmity for the Jinchuriki, no preconceived notions positive or negative, just hope and excitement to get to know and be around him. He'd wondered for so long what it would be like to have a family, people who cared about him unconditionally, and now that was no longer a hypothetical, and it felt good. Strange, unfamiliar, yet pleasant, a long-buried idea that was finally being recognized. It didn't change how he felt about Konoha or the people in it or even the path he'd chosen, but it definitely gave him pause with respect to his next course of action. His brain had been wired by Zetsu to notice those pauses and analyze them, and Naruto would admit to being curious as to where this new connection could lead. He blinked, the moment in time frozen by two sets of baby blue eyes suddenly broken. Yeah, I'll be back. Inogen's beatific smile caused another upswell of sentiment in Naruto's chest, the younger blonde cheering in unbridled joy. Ino stepped up then, grabbing the Jinchuriki by the elbow and hauling him out of their son's earshot while announcing in a raised voice, "Stay there, Inogen, I'll be right back." When she deemed they were far enough away, she released her grip and crossed her arms over her chest. "That was kind of you," she conceded. "I'm not a monster." "No, you just learned from one." Naruto shoved down the flicker of annoyance at Ino's snark. "Thanks. For covering for me. I know it can't be easy to lie for me." "No, it's not," Ino interjected curtly. She looked like she wanted to add something more, but then decided against it and said instead, "So, you can use Mokuton." "That's impressive." "How?" "It's not Mokuton. It's just natural energy." Ino's raised eyebrow made him realize that most people wouldn't understand that, so Naruto added, "Plants are alive. They have chakra. Kinda. I use that chakra." "Got it. Makes about as much sense as anything else." She was quiet for a moment before continuing, "I can tell you still hate being here, in Konoha, but, did you mean what you said? About coming back to see him?" "Yeah. He kinda makes you want to go out of your way for him." "Kids are like that," was the flat response. "If you're lucky, maybe you'll understand that one day." The venom in that single statement was so subtle, so toxic, that Naruto wished he could bottle it and add it to his collection. Ino was still bitter about his decision, of that there was no question. And the sad part was, in trying to be honest to earn just a smidgen of redemption, he'd placed himself over a barrel, and she knew it. Then the Yamanaka released a sigh so heavy with mixed emotions that Naruto couldn't decipher what she was thinking. "Fine then. But you owe me first." Naruto breathed his own sigh. "Yeah, a deal's a deal. So whatcha need?" Ino shot him a small, twisted grin that came off as more of a grimace. "You're not going to like it." "What else is new?" "LLL. You're pathetic." "Oh good, you're here. Just what I needed." He doesn't sound very sincere. "You think?" "Look Zetsu, I'm kinda in the middle of something here, so if you don't mind. You're running errands for the blonde temptress, we know." "How come?" "It was part of our agreement. I get to see my son, but I have to do her a favor." Black Zetsu scoffed. "Fool. You reap what you sow, why don't you just not do it?" "Because she'll know if I don't, and I'd like to see Inogen again." "My son," he clarified at Zetsu's perplexed expression. "Stupid name," Black Zetsu muttered. To Naruto, White Zetsu asked, "Why?" The blonde didn't reply right away, searching instead for the best answer to that question. Finally, he said, "There's something about him, I feel a connection to him, and I want to explore that. It's new, and interesting, and that's what you've always told me to try." "Is that so wrong?" he asked thoughtlessly, and as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a mistake. "If you think this isn't the precursor to suckering you into returning to Konoha, you're a fool. You worked so hard to escape, Naruto-kun, is returning what you really want? First it'll be your attachment to the boy, then it'll be an affinity for the blonde, and then you'll just be another shinobi of the village. Your emotions will be your death. Oh, police, spare me the lecture. You're a filthy hypocrite. What are you? All you've done since you've met me is go on about independence, but if that's so true, why did you ever save my life back in the land of waves, huh? You weren't prepared to defend yourself. Then by your own creed, you should have let me die, Naruto asserted. But you didn't, and ever since, you've hung around, teaching me things, watching over me, doing me favors with no benefit to yourself, even as you've justified it as having fun or something equally ridiculous. You wanted to see who I'd grow up to be and what I'd do, that's why you told me about Inogen in the first place. You may pretend you don't, but you actually care about me in some weird way, and whether or not that's been your primary motivator, you have since I started learning from you. But you're somehow missing the bigger picture. We had no connection, and I still wanted to learn from you. Now imagine the potential if we'd met and I had a hero complex for you. Or you'd been someone I'd spent years wanting to meet, and suddenly you showed up. Don't you think I'd hang on to every word you said, soak up every lesson you had to offer? Zetsu was silent for a moment, whether because he was taken aback at the Jinchuriki's diatribe or because he didn't have a clever response already lined up. Naruto didn't know. When he did speak, it was the most unsure he'd ever sounded. You're manipulating them? Naruto shrugged. What I feel around Inogen is real. And it's humanizing. That was the real crux, he realized suddenly. When he'd been in Konoha, he'd been so ostracized that he'd never felt human. Zetsu had never demonized him, but he'd also never treated the blonde as more than a project of sorts, and Naruto had taken each lesson and integrated it into his personal philosophy like a machine. Even his life as a renegade had forced him to detach himself from society in order to stay above it all. The only time he'd ever felt like a person, a true human with emotional capacity, had been when he'd been with Team 10 or 1010, and even he couldn't deny that those times had been fun. They were, after all, the only allures he'd had to staying in Konoha. Being around Inogen was nostalgic, a reminder of who he'd been when he'd let go of his machinations. He shook off the epiphany and continued, I'd like to see what happens next. But it's not gonna magically change everything I've been through, or how I feel about everyone else. And if I can teach him to think for himself and not get trapped by Konoha's ideals, don't you think it's worth it to try? You did when it was me. Deep, throaty laughter emanated from Zetsu's dark side. Your ingenuity is truly impressive at times. I applaud your audacity. However, you do realize you have an uphill battle with the blonde, right? I'm not hinging my beliefs on whether this works. What will be, you know. So you're not gonna cry if it doesn't go the way you want? Naruto shot him a flat look. Doubt it. I don't know how I'll feel if it ends, but I assume I'll be able to move on. In the meantime, I'll do what's asked of me, provided it's doable. You're very dedicated, Naruto-kun. It's very admirable. Yeah. He drawled, unsure of the sincerity of his mentor's words, thanks. Anyway, I should, get to work on this. Gotcha. We'll be watching. Of course you will, Naruto muttered. One last word of advice, watch your step. Slippery slopes such as this have a tendency to make one lose their footing. And once you're unstable, White Zetsu finished, puffing a breath to imitate blowing someone over. It's bye-bye from there. You'll end up like us. And with that cryptic warning, he was gone. Naruto pondered the former Kusanin's parting words as he continued his vigilance. He'd never gotten the story of how Zetsu had come to possess his unique physiology, just vague, snippy commentary, but that final warning had the same air of personal experience attached to it that the plant man had used to create his self-reliance philosophy. The problem was that the blonde already was like the plant man, barring the obvious lack of physical similarities. While his personality didn't have the same serious versus playful dichotomy Zetsu's did, Naruto had struggled with doing what was right and doing what he wanted for years, teetering precariously on the precipice more often than he cared to admit. Morality and sentiment had given him strong reasons to protect the likes of Ino, Shikamaru, Choji, and Tenten for years, even as protecting them had helped him along the way. It brought to mind the question of whether there were truly any selfless acts. Or, alternatively, if any of the selfish choices he'd made hadn't also been boons for others. After all, in manipulating and connecting with Gaara over the years to further his own agenda, he'd given the Ichibi Jinchuriki his own freedom, the opportunity to live his own life. In leaving Konoha to pursue his goals, he'd relieved the village of Akatsuki's threat, easing the minds of the people who seemed to hate him and feared another recurrence of the Kyuubi attack. In making herbal remedies to support his own livelihood, he was healing the maladies of others, and by wanting to connect with his son, he was aiding Konoha. He shook his head to rid himself of the thought. If he followed that logic, he would end up lost in endless rabbit holes, analyzing every action he'd ever taken and every action he could take moving forward to determine the hypothetical pros and cons for both himself and anyone he interacted with. Firmly decided on not revisiting every nook and cranny of his life, Naruto returned to the task at hand. Konoha Hospital loomed ahead, most windows dark as the surrounding night. The few that were lit were likely hallways or break rooms for the evening shift. The blonde couldn't imagine performing surgery so late at night. With a resigned sigh, he disappeared into the ground and traveled towards the hospital, transitioning from the earth to the building's concrete walls. Cautiously, he began to explore each of the rooms, poking his face out at discrete locations to scan his surroundings. 4 sleeping, patients' bedrooms, an operating room, and a bathroom later, Naruto began to wonder how long it was going to take to find what he was looking for. After another 2 bedrooms and a storage closet, the blonde finally lucked into a break room. One nurse appeared to be napping in an armchair, and another was making himself something to drink. Naruto didn't blame them, pulling the graveyard shift seemed like a thankless job. He went through the hand signs for the dokujiri and expelled a cloud of sleeping gas into the room. Within seconds, the conscious nurse was slumped on the floor, his spilled drink a puddle beside him. Damn it all. He'd have to deal with it later. In the meantime, he approached the nurse in the armchair and injected her with an antidote to the sleeping gas. When the woman gasped to wakefulness, Naruto blew a palmful of devil's breath powder into her face. Her eyelids drooped to half-mast and her body slumped further into the furniture, a boneless slouch. Now, he mused, what do I ask? Quietly, so as to not break the hospital's atmosphere, he asked, what village do you belong to? Konoha, intoned the nurse. Can you deceive yourself into believing that? Who do you serve? Hokage-sama. Who trained you? Tsunade-sama. Naruto tried to think of another question to ask to prove the woman was actually a spy and came up short. Go back to sleep, he murmured. The powder he'd used was mixed with a small dose of psychotropics, so each of his interviewees would think they'd hallucinated him, if they remembered the encounter at all. The woman dropped off, and Naruto moved on to the male nurse, going through the same drug and question routine. None of the answers changed, and after ordering him to clean up the spilled tea and change his stained clothes before returning to his duties, the blonde melded back into the hospital's walls. Naruto managed to intercept and interrogate 4 other nurses over the course of the next 2 hours, but none of them gave any different responses to his 3 questions. Between the effects of the drugs and the repetitive answers, the Jinchuriki was starting to feel like he'd infiltrated a cult. Considering how villages indoctrinated their shinobi, the idea probably wasn't too far-fetched. This plan isn't going to work. Not only would it take far too long to interview every worker at the hospital, especially considering the various shifts and schedules, but the longer he stayed, the more risk he was at of being discovered. Not only that, but the phrasing of his 3rd question had started to give him pause. He'd borne witness to both Tsunade's personality and training firsthand. There wouldn't be anyone working at the hospital who she wouldn't have trained, or at least approved of after rigorous testing. If there really was a spy from the Hidden Rain among the medical staff, he or she would have had to be in Konoha long enough to either go through the medical program or have already been proficient enough at healing to pass Tsunade's stringent requirements. What if he doesn't heal? Hospitals had plenty of administrative staff, and it would be far easier to go unnoticed if your job was to push paperwork rather than heal. Plus, if the goal was to learn about Konoha's shinobi, what better way was there than to have access to years of medical records documenting physical fitness, mental well-being, maybe even clan-specific medical issues or sensitivities? There's gotta be a basement or something where they keep all that stuff, he thought, melding through the floor and aiming for the structure's foundation. As it turned out, there was a basement, and it ended up being better lit than Naruto was expecting. The long white hallway was almost blinding compared to how dark most of the hospital was, locked doors with placards describing what was hidden beyond lining both sides. Naruto read each placard from his position within the ceiling, eventually finding the records room and moving towards it. A quick peek inside revealed all the lights turned on and the sound of rustling papers from one corner of the room. The source of the noise was a woman in her early 20s, by the blonde's estimate. She was pretty in a plain sort of way, he supposed, with no real memorable physical characteristics, a perfect spy. He was startled when she looked up at him, a hard expression in her dark eyes. Sensor type. Dropping to the floor allowed him to avoid the kunai thrown at his head, and she rushed forward to engage him in combat while he was still in a crouch. Another activation of the Shinra Bancho saw her kick sailing over him as he sank into the floor, and he quickly rose back up to take advantage of her surprise. He grabbed her other leg and pulled, bringing her to the floor with a grunt. One pinprick of a senbon and she was paralyzed where she lay. Naruto let out the breath he didn't know he'd been holding, waiting in the silence for any indication the tussle had been discovered. When several minutes passed with no further incident, he withdrew a handful of devil's breath powder and a jar containing an antiparalytic from his stash. He blew the powder into the woman's face and then applied the antiparalytic. All right, what village do you belong to? Amige Cure. Naruto felt a great sense of accomplishment swell in his chest, and couldn't resist the victorious yes that escaped his lips. And who do you serve? The woman appeared to struggle for a brief moment before responding, Pain-sama. Who the hell is Pain-sama? Naruto wondered aloud. Last he'd heard, AIM was under the strict control of Hanzo the Salamander. Our savior, replied the AIM Nin. I wasn't, never mind. He knocked her out, grateful that his hunch had worked out. His task done, he turned his attention to the records the spy had been rooting through, skimming through the paperwork and then setting it aside, uninterested in the histories of random Konoha nin. While I'm down here. He began wandering the room's aisles, peering at any available labels to try to determine how the information was organized. After almost an hour of searching, Naruto was about ready to tear his hair out. There were just too many records for too many people, and to the uninformed, the organization felt very haphazard. Finding his own records seemed an impossible task, assuming, of course, they even existed anymore. After all, Konoha presumed him dead, so what point was there in keeping a dead man's history? And that wasn't even taking into account his status as a Jinchuriki, which probably wasn't available to the hospital staff. It was beyond frustrating that the only thing he wanted from the hidden leaf, the answer to his lineage, and whether he truly was the son of the Yondaime, was beyond his reach. Unless he devoted far more time than he had, and thus risked discovery by Konoha, it seemed a definite answer to his query would continue to elude him. Miffed and dour, Naruto hoisted the unconscious Nin over his shoulder and left the hospital with the attack prevention technique. With frequent peeks to the outside world to guide his path, he made his way to Ino's home, rising up through the exterior wall and poking his head into Ino's room. "Hey, Ino," he whispered, "oh, you're awake." The platinum blonde was standing in the middle of her room with her hands raised to use one of her clan's patented mental techniques. "Naruto," she hissed, blue eyes narrowed in fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing? It's 4 in the morning. Best time to spy," he told her, stepping out into the room. Speaking of which, he unceremoniously dropped the Nin on Ino's vacated bed. "Here you go." "What the hell? Who is this? Did you kidnap her?" "The hospital spy you asked for. I thought that was obvious." "It's 4 in the morning," Ino reiterated through gritted teeth, "and I was sleeping. Like a normal person. Excuse me for needing a moment." "You're excused." Ino shot him an icy glare, trying to impress upon him her lack of amusement. Naruto shrugged, and when she gave up on trying to intimidate him, he watched his former friend run pale fingers through blonde locks and then rub tiredly at her eyes. In that moment, she looked older than he remembered, even considering that they were, in fact, older. Suddenly uncomfortable with how different they were, he angled his body away from her and said, "Well, I'm outta here." "And where do you think you're going?" Ino demanded. "Following up on something. I don't like not knowing something." "Not knowing what?" came Ino's hot reply. "And what the hell am I supposed to do with her?" she asked, gesturing towards the bed. Naruto was already stepping back into the wall as he answered, "You're smart, you'll figure something out. I'll be in touch." At the blonde's annoyed scoff, he paused, turning so that his head, now the only visible part of him, was facing her. "Hey, tell Inogen I said hi, and that I'll see him soon." Ino's haughty expression softened at that, her crossed arms relaxing to her sides at the unexpected admission. Now she reminded him of the Ino he'd grown up with, the one who cared and worried about her teammates more than she was willing to admit. She graced him with a small, sat-up turn of her lips and a brief nod, and then Naruto was gone. LLL. There was something unnatural about the rain surrounding Amigakure. Sure, Naruto understood that being in the land of rain and infiltrating the village hidden in rain likely meant dealing with precipitation, and the gray clouds that had loomed over his journey to the village had suggested it was a common phenomenon, but still, it was weird. Rain fell in what appeared to be a near-perfect circle around the village, which explained the moat separating the floodplains and skyscrapers. He watched the rain from afar for a time, wondering at the best strategy to avoid what seemed like an obvious trap while still getting inside the village. And then it stopped. Blue eyes blinked in surprise, as if to confirm what he was seeing was real. He half expected the skies to clear to reveal a bright sun and beautiful rainbow, as portrayed in the movies, and grunted to himself when nothing of the sort happened. The sky was still gray and cloudy, the path ahead was still water, but now the air was clear of moisture. Still feels like a trap. He heaved a sigh and jumped down from his perch, taking tentative steps towards the moat's edge and eventually upon the water itself. When nothing immediately happened, he walked forward with more confidence, making his way to the village at the moat's center. Nearing the water's interior edge revealed a great metal wall towering over him that had been hidden by the country's haze. Naruto rolled his eyes. Like it wasn't difficult enough to get inside already. Standing in its shadow, he craned his neck backwards in an attempt to gauge its height. Over? Or under? He mused, glancing at the water beneath him. Or neither. Subverting both, Naruto spread his chakra into the wall and stepped into it with the attack prevention technique. Moving through the metal was quick work, and when he approached the other side, he stuck his face through to get a glimpse of the village. Darkness greeted him. He allowed several seconds for his eyes to adjust and realized that a building was blocking his view, pipes and other metallic appurtenances he couldn't identify littering the alley he found himself in. One of the structures belched steam in his face, and the humidity warmed his clammy skin. Between the frigid metal and the chilly climate, he was just now realizing how cold it was. Naruto stepped out from the confines of the wall, hunkering down beside the building. A brief attempt to draw on any nearby natural energy to get an idea of where people were located revealed nothing, and he scowled to himself. The hidden rain was too urban for him to find any strength from the natural world in it, which meant he would have to move even more cautiously than he'd anticipated. The blonde pulled up his hoodie and strolled out of the alley onto a sparsely populated side street. Those few who were out and about seemed to ignore everyone else, walking around with heads tucked into the collars of their coats as much as physically possible. He exhaled, watching his breath coalesce into a warm cloud of air and then walking through it. "This place sucks," he groused, shoving his hands in his pockets. Why anyone would stay here? A large crowd of people passed by on the street perpendicular to his own, interrupting his internal musing on the inner workings of the hidden rain. A gem? A quick geographical check told him that most were walking away from the village's center. Unable to fathom what would be so attractive on the village's outskirts, he wandered against the main flow, keeping to the outside of the crowd with his head ducked. The road eventually opened up into a town square, another metal skyscraper at its head. A short line of people stood before a stone statue that was set in the center of the town square. Several people in front were kneeling before the effigy, bowed before it in reverence. Naruto stayed on the fringes of the gathering, edging closer until the murmuring at the head of the crowd became distinguishable. They were praying, he realized. Meaningless words of solace, all whispered to the monument the citizens of the hidden rain were prostrated before. Variations of well wishes for Tenchi and Pain-sama mixed with other words reached the blonde's ears. Tenchi, watch over Pain-sama, seemed to be the repeated sentiment of a large portion of the crowd. Gleaning nothing from their sentiments, Naruto finally spared the statue his attention, curious as to who was worthy of so much respect and adoration. Judging by the hair bun, he assumed the figure was female, though the high-collared, knee-length cloak disguised much of her features. The cloud patterns on the cloak were chiseled with exquisite care. Whatever warmth his hoodie was providing quickly dissipated as his blood turned to ice. He knew this statue. Those stone eyes had been wide with shock as he descended upon their owner, severing head from neck. Conan, he thought, mind tumultuous as he turned away from the statue and strode towards the village's outskirts as quickly as he could without arousing suspicion. She's Tenchi, and she's Akatsuki, and AIM is worshipping her, and Pain, which means Pain must also be connected to Akatsuki. And AIM is infiltrating Konoha because they're trying to flush me out. He phased through the metal wall and hastened his speed to a sprint across the water, his flight mimicking the rapid pace firing of his thoughts. Once he reached the trees that merged into the land of fire, he could race towards Konoha with the Shinra Bancho. Even as he thought it, even as he ran at breakneck speed across the water's surface for the warm embrace of the woods, he wondered why he was going back. Sentimentality, Zetsu would call it, before rattling off any other number of synonyms that basically amounted to Naruto being an idiot. And, admittedly, rushing towards the village which had forsaken him, and vice versa, to battle an S-rank ninja whose purpose was to capture him didn't exactly disprove his mentor's assumed comments. That the shadowy organization was plotting an invasion upon a shinobi village, let alone one of the main five, spoke volumes of its desperation. But Pain had a goal, one he'd been chasing for at least the last decade, and as Naruto had lived with a similar sense of single-mindedness for only half as long, he knew Akatsuki wouldn't rest until it got what it wanted. It was just unfortunate Akatsuki wanted him. But, he rationalized, this opportunity was almost too good to pass up. There was no telling how many members still comprised the organization, and his previous skirmishes with them had proven direct confrontation was messy. This time, however, Konoha was their most immediate target, and the shinobi there could serve as enough of a distraction that Naruto could take advantage of the situation. Based on his past experiences, it was the most prudent move. At least, that's what he told himself as he reached the trees and felt the warm embrace of the greenery. There was a flicker of some instinctive need to protect that which was a part of him, and he withdrew the seed which allowed him to communicate with Ino even as he sank into the earth and let a different set of instincts take over. Natural energy coursed through the seed and towards its twin in Konoha. After several seconds, the seed split, a tiny sprout tickling the inside of his clenched fist. Naruto immediately cut off the flow of natural energy, cursing his lack of wherewithal. Unbidden, he'd overwhelmed the seed and lost any hope of transmitting any further urgency to Ino. As he released his grip on the now useless seedling, it occurred to the blonde that, over 20 years prior, his father must have gone through some echo of what he was currently experiencing. The race to face an enemy who was rumored to be vastly superior, while simultaneously protecting a life he was connected to, it was as similar to the yondaime as he'd ever felt, barring the physical resemblance. Granted, the yondaime had faced down a literal demon, and Naruto was preparing to fight a man, albeit a very powerful man who was specifically targeting the blonde, but regardless, the scenario was uncanny. If believing in Niji's idea of fate wasn't anathema to his very being, the Jinchuriki might have considered himself an ironic pawn, manipulated to make some higher deity laugh. As it was, he needed his wits about him to not meet his father's fate. With that resolve in mind, he took a deep breath and attempted to regain control over his emotional equilibrium, but too many questions continued to plague him. Why was Akatsuki making a move now? Did they get Gaara? How many people would he have to fight to be free of the organization? Did they not know that he wasn't part of Konoha anymore? Every mile he traveled was filled with another slew of unanswered queries and half-formed plans. Predominant among them was the idea that he was walking straight into the lion's den, a scenario he'd spent years avoiding, and what was he thinking? Following that came a number of potential battle strategies for what he might face, which he focused on with intense gratitude. Anything to take his mind off the fact that he was a filthy hypocrite and he'd done a terrible job of following his own creed, all to explore something he'd never had but always wanted. It was new, and exciting, and deserved a chance, because he didn't have the experience to make a justified opinion, and there was something in those moments interacting with people who cared about him that made him feel human. Shut up, shut up, shut up. He cursed repetitively in his mind to fill the silence and stop the questions, finding enough irritation at himself to fill the rest of the journey. When he guessed that he'd gotten close enough, he spread his chakra out to the surrounding network of roots, analyzing everything he could with the green sight technique. The input nearly blinded him. Huge masses of chakra, indistinguishable from each other, were gathered above and far away from him, Konoha, he assumed, either preparing a defense or already in the midst of a counterattack. Small clusters spread throughout the village contrasted the significantly larger conglomeration at the center, and Naruto wondered at the size of Akatsuki's forces that they seemed to be causing so much trouble. Not my problem. He wasn't interested in helping Konoha, of diving into the middle of a war which would only serve to distract and confuse him. He had a goal. Focus. There. On the outskirts, in the middle of a lush field, was a soul chakra source. Either that was Pain, the general overseeing his troops from afar, or Konoha had been training its shinobi shoddily since he'd disappeared. He made a beeline for that signature, and when he was in its range, began gathering more natural energy. Take this, asshole, he thought, dispersing the collected chakra into the field. Senpo, Kusanagi. Though he couldn't see it, he could feel the grass above grow rigid and long, turning what was probably a training field into a 5-foot-tall turf of green skewers. A quick check with the green sight technique showed the chakra signature still present, still unmoved, though if it had been a person, the chakra should have disappeared with his life. Naruto's brow furrowed in confusion. Then he heard the voice, and his blood ran cold. Khhehe, so you finally showed up, eh? Good. I was getting bored waiting. It wasn't Pain, but in some way, hearing Kisame above him was even worse. The memory of his prior failure to beat the blue-skinned shinobi surfaced, a stark reminder of just how out of his depth he was. His mind began to scream at him for his stupidity, and he released his hold on the grass cutter technique with the intention of moving away. I know you're there, QB. Samahata doesn't forget a chakra like yours. If you won't come out to play, I guess I'll just have to make you. Suetun, Chikaharu. The sound of rushing water distracted the blonde from his grand escape plan right before the earth he was melded with flooded. Concentration broken, he lost hold of the attack prevention technique, but at that point, the rising water had broken the surface in a geyser, and Naruto heaved a great gasp of air, dirt, and water. He dropped to the ground with a squelch, mud plastered across his face and clothes, then pushed himself to a standing position and spat. Yuck. No distractions this time, QB, Kisame called. Just you and me. False bravado had Naruto opening his arms in a gesture of welcome, commenting, and here you are, allowing me to recover. The former Kirinin laughed. Naruto cringed at the cruelty that rang with his mirth. Where's the fun in beating a broken target? I want you on your feet when we fight, so I can watch you fall when I cut off your legs. Besides, waiting for you has been painful, I want to make sure you know what I felt. He rushed Naruto then, Samahata's hilt gripped in his hand. The blonde had just enough time to summon natural energy from the surrounding grass and extend the bamboo hidden in his sleeves. Kisame's sword was stopped inches from his side, held away by the unyielding plants. The Akatsuki grinned at him, and Naruto grimaced in return, straining to hold his ground under the strength of the huge sword and larger man. Hey, so you've got a couple of new tricks, eh? Fuck, you! Naruto growled, tapping into the natural energy around him and throwing it once more into the grass. Senpo, Kusanagi. Blades of grass lanced through Kisame's legs, and the taller shinobi swung his sword downward, using its bulk to shred the greenery. Naruto grabbed one of the torn pieces of grass and brought it to his lips. Senpo, Kyuzabu. A buzzing, haunting melody reverberated from between the blonde's lips. It evened out into a somber dirge, Kisame's muscles slackening the longer he hummed. The sage art, grass whistle technique was one of Naruto's 2 genjutsu techniques, and while it worked best when enacted from afar, with his presence hidden, he was honestly happy it was working at all. Given the impulse he'd enacted it with, Kisame seemed like the type who would just muscle through any sort of relaxing hallucination. While the shark-like shinobi was entranced, Naruto extended the bamboo over his right hand and punched towards his enemy's throat. Samehada bent impossibly, blocking the attack. Blue eyes widened in shock. What the, Hee, nice try, Kyubi, but you're not gonna get me like that with Samehada around. Naruto got up from where he'd been kicked, groaning as his stomach protested the movement. Stupid bastard, that sword is ridiculous. Suetun, Bakusui Shoha. A deluge of water escaped the Akatsukinin's mouth and formed into a series of massive waves. Naruto released the natural energy he'd gathered and broke off the extra bamboo, allowing his hands freedom to move through seals. Futon, Arashionome. Wind enveloped him in a protective sphere just in time for the exploding water colliding wave to break over him. He forced more chakra into the technique, whipping the makeshift shield into a frenzied zephyr to counteract the crushing torrent. Then a giant shark formed from water slammed into the storm's eye technique at full speed, and the force was enough to send Naruto careening into the center of the tsunami. He pulled the surrounding winds tighter around himself and then released it all in a burst of energy. Futon, Kakadai Kiri. Water exploded from around him like a burst balloon only to rain down in a cold shower. Naruto could feel rivulets running down his face and neck. It was almost refreshing, if he wasn't counting its source. Surprise! Naruto screamed as Samehada shredded his side, each scale of its unbandaged form tearing through his skin. He unleashed a reactionary burst of wind that sent Kisame skidding backwards, instinctively placing a hand over the wound to stifle the pain. Distantly, he registered the former Kirinin's laughter. Through the haze of pain, he summoned enough energy to expel a smoky dokujiri, shrouding the area in thick cover. Kisame continued to laugh. I told you, you can't hide from me. And now that Samehada's got a taste, it's gonna suck you dry. Just need a moment? Reaching behind him, the blonde unhooked a vial attached to his waist, uncorking it deftly and letting several seeds stored inside drop out. He stoppered the vial with the pad of his thumb just as Kisame's voice called out, Suetun, Dai Bakusui Shoha. Water flooded the area, sending him tumbling end over end. Something large rammed into him, and Naruto fought to hold what little breath he had collected, more seeds spilling out as he was swirled around. When he managed to orient himself and see what had hit him, he had to remind himself not to open his mouth in horror. What could only be described as a hybrid sharkman floated before him. Grayish-blue skin covered a muscled body with humanoid limbs, large fins growing backwards from the creature's elbows. An even larger dorsal fin stretched from its head, and a thick tail sprouted from its back. Fingers and toes appeared to have morphed into claws, webbing taking up the space between each digit. Sharp teeth displaying Kisame's telltale smirk brought back the full memory of his first encounter with the Akatsukinin and how he'd easily overwhelmed his and AKA's team up. Naruto failed to repress the shiver of apprehension that jolted through his body. As if sensing his fear, Kisame charged again, and Naruto unleashed a torrent of wind from his free palm in his enemy's direction. The Sharkman was undeterred by the assault, allowing it to break across his face without slowing down, and Naruto barely managed to change tactics in time, aiming his palm straight up to propel himself closer to the ground. He could feel the water shift as Kisame's hand came within an inch of grabbing him. He activated the violent wind palm once more to propel himself up, and again, he could feel the motion of the water as Kisame barely missed him. More chakra increased the Repusho's output, sending Naruto rocketing up. He was forced to continuously adjust his path as Kisame attempted to capture him, though it occurred to the Jinchuriki that the ex-Mist Shinobi was simply just toying with him, zigzagging haphazardly until he finally broke through the surface. The air felt invigorating on his face and in his lungs, and he mentally thanked Asuma for the deep breathing lessons. Using the Kaze Nagar to levitate in midair and catch his breath, the blonde could see that his enemy had trapped him in a dome of water, reminding him yet again of when he'd abandoned AKA. It was a testament to the Sharkman's strength that he could shape and hold such a monstrosity, let alone summon the requisite water in the first place. As he watched, the dome appeared to shift, its liquid mass growing taller as its diameter receded. Naruto adjusted his propulsion to the left, and the fluid followed, reaching up to submerge him in its depths. It can move? What kind of jutsu is this? Muscular arms suddenly wrapped around his body, locking his arms to his side. What? Hihei, gotcha now. Naruto managed to tilt his head, horror-stricken to find Kisame's shark-like face leering at him over his shoulder. The wind stream technique petered out as the Akatsuki nin, who had apparently jumped out of the watery dome to grab him, siphoned off his chakra. Sharp teeth buried themselves deep in his left shoulder. Ah! His scream turned into a gargle as the pair splashed into water, Kisame dragging him into the dome's depths. He began to feel lightheaded, whether from being drowned or his chakra being taken, he couldn't tell. Loose fingers released the vial he'd been holding, blue eyes blearily watching as it sank alongside him. Damn it, not gonna die here. He closed his eyes, focusing instead on the green life that comprised the training area and beyond, the namesake of the village he'd once called home. Natural energy flowed through him, a steady thrum of brightness which Kisame seemed unable to either detect or absorb. With renewed strength and increasing desperation, he mentally felt for the seeds scattered across the ground in his swimming escapades and used that energy to push them into a new growth cycle. Blue eyes snapped open, the dark patterns of his sage status rimming them. Senpo, Haru Saicho no Jutsu. The seeds burst to life, months of growth occurring in seconds. Fledgling sequoias sprouted at his command, treetops with full foliage forming with aid from rich soil and an abundance of water. Naruto felt himself rolled over in Kisame's grasp several times as the Sharkman dodged the growing trees. Then a lucky branch sprouted, spearing the swordsman through his left flank and forcing him to momentarily release his grip. The blonde remained still, focused on the spring's growth technique, as a canopy rose up beneath him, cushioning his rise through the surface of the watery dome. Sitting upright, Naruto hacked up the water he'd inhaled and looked about, admiring the towering trees still growing around him. He glanced over the side of the treetop, searching for a sign of Kisame, but the Sharkman was nowhere to be seen. With the sun shining down and even more plant life to supply him with natural energy, the Jinchuriki clambered to his feet with renewed confidence, reaching further for all the seeds that hadn't yet grown. "Eat this, bastard," he bellowed, pushing beyond the spring's growth technique. Senpo, Jukai Koten. Roots and branches exploded to life from within the crevices of the already grown trees as the nativity of a world of trees technique took effect. These were the beginnings of banyan trees, which formed by taking over a host tree and growing extensive, thick root networks down towards the ground in search of soil and water. And thanks to Kisame, water was bountiful. The banyan trees continued to grow at an accelerated rate, trunks doubling and tripling in size, with long, spindly roots plunging to the depths of the liquid dome. Soon enough, his homegrown forest of trees covered the expanse of Kisame's water technique, an amalgamation of the battler's specialties. A massive shark comprised entirely of water broke the dome's surface, maw open wide to swallow the blonde where he stood. Naruto raised an arm towards it, palm out, and uttered, "Senpo, ha no erasure." The leaves of the branch above him detached and flew at the giant fish, their razor-sharp edges shredding its form. 3 more sharks attempted the same tactic only to meet the same fate. With each destroyed shark, Naruto felt himself slowly growing more anxious. Both he and Kisame were understandably determined to fight in the environment that gave them their respective edge, and even his encroachment into the Sharkman's territory wasn't serving as a deterrent. "I'll just have to take over completely." He reached for a pocket of his pants and pulled out a storage scroll, despite being soaked, channeling chakra into it still summoned a mass of seaweed harvested from the land of water. It dropped to the water and floated on the surface, a tiny dot in a veritable lake. Suetun, Daikoden no Jutsu. Naruto whipped around, eyes widening in horror. The sizes of the previous shark attacks were pitiful compared to the monstrosity that roared towards him. It ripped through trees like they were toothpicks, ravaging the forest and leaving fallen timber in its wake. His body spasmed as the flora was destroyed, gasping in confusion at the sudden pain racking his body. Unable to move, the blonde was swallowed whole by the beast, which carried him back into the dome. Kisame was determined to drown him in. He could feel the strength of his natural energy wane with the toppling of his makeshift forest, the unknown pain still coursing through his body. As if sensing weakness, Kisame's monstrous form appeared, speeding towards him. Not done yet, he told himself through gritted teeth, using his senjutsu in one final push. Senpo, Jukai Koten. As Kisame drew close, the seaweed he'd dropped multiplied exponentially, tendrils of green twisting through the depths of the dome. Blooms of algae engulfed everything, blotting out the light and turning their surroundings into an underwater jungle. Kisame thrashed within the sudden mass of plants, working to find a path towards the blonde, but the kelp forest gave Naruto a fresh burst of energy. With renewed vigor, the Jinchuriki strengthened the underwater plants, increasing their durability and forcing them to coalesce in even tighter clumps. They smothered the Sharkman, wrapping him in increasingly stronger restraints. Naruto watched as several tendrils wrapped around the Akatsuki Nin's throat, pneumatocysts, small pods growing regularly along the kelp, barely visible along their lengths. His hands came together in what he hoped would be his final set of seals. Senpo, Tain Bakudan. The pneumatocysts exploded with enough force to send Naruto into an uncontrolled tumble through the water, a chain reaction of reverberating booms following him as more pods detonated. After several seconds of disorientation, Naruto realized he was no longer underwater. He was laying on a bed of seaweed in at least an inch of water spread over an area too large to even consider. Blood flowed sluggishly from a mixture of wounds inflicted by Kisame and sustained during his sage art, seed bomb technique. Kisame's jutsu fell apart. Did I get him? He rolled over, coughing up water and taking in his surroundings. Blue eyes landed on a blue-gray arm jutting up from a nearby mass of seaweed. Naruto dragged himself over, wary of tricks. When he was close enough, he towed the limb enough to reveal it had been blown off at the shoulder. Further scrutiny revealed other body parts half buried in blooms of kelp. When he came across the head, Naruto collapsed at the sight, relief and exhaustion flooding his tense body. I did it. Holy shit, I actually did it. Eyes closed in peaceful contemplation of his success, he briefly considered taking a nap in the bed of seaweed, despite the awful smell it exuded. It had been years since he'd fought an opponent anywhere near Kisame's caliber, certainly not since he'd actually learned about natural energy, and so the limitations of his sage status had never been stretched so far. And he'd felt pain while using senjutsu, which was both new and worrisome. Not that he had much time to ruminate on it, exhausted or not, Kisame hadn't been the reason he'd come back to the hidden leaf. With a groan, Naruto leveraged himself to his feet and summoned supplies to treat the worst of his injuries. He shucked his hoodie, waterlogged and shredded beyond repair, to the side to liberally apply poultices and bandages, wincing with each wound. When that was done, he carefully drew on a trace amount of natural energy to use the Midori Shiryoku, considering it a good sign when no additional pain accompanied the activation. The green sight technique showed Konoha still embroiled in battle with Akatsuki's forces, chakra sources spread throughout the village, and a single chakra signature to the northwest, high in one of the country's trees. Gotcha, I hope. Slowly, Naruto melded into the earth and moved towards the outlying chakra, gaining speed along the way. As he reacquainted himself with the network of roots that comprised the Land of Fire's forests, the blonde began to feel reinvigorated, natural energy seeping into his skin from the untouched nature. He activated the green sight technique once more to check his progress, pausing in surprise. Another chakra signature, no, 2 chakra signatures, one on the heels of the other, were approaching his intended destination at an alarming rate. Naruto scowled to himself. Akatsuki or Konoha? He wondered. Either way, probably not good for me. But Naruto raced towards where the pair were headed, aiming to get ahead of the leader. It hadn't worked against Kisame, but with a new enemy came new strategies, and the element of surprise generally worked in his favor. He surfaced from the earth just in time to see someone wearing a black cloak with red clouds descend from the treetops. You're mine, he crowed, leaping off the ground. Senpo, Sashiki no Jutsu. The man noticed him seconds before impact, clapping his hands together as he fell. A cloud of smoke enveloped them, and when it cleared, Naruto found the bamboo shoots of his cutting technique sprouting from a giant panda with fur as hard as rock. Bullshit. Gravity forced them to the forest floor, where the summoned defense disappeared in another burst of smoke, giving Naruto a better look of his enemy, long orange hair held in a high ponytail, kinda like Ino, he mused, black piercings and studs implanted along his face, and strange-looking eyes that gave Zetsu's a pass at normality. "Kyubi," spoke the man. "I knew you would come." His voice was controlled yet quiet, a storm ready to rain at a moment's notice. Strange eyes glanced to Naruto's right, where the rustling of leaves could be heard. Naruto tensed, expecting the worst and hoping for the best. "And I see you decided to follow me, Jiraiya." "Pain," hollered the Sannin. "You'll pay for what you, Naruto?" "Ah shit. Jiraiya. Been a while. You've looked better." Blood stained the Sannin's clothes and dripped down his left arm, lending him a weary appearance that was further exemplified by his labored breathing. It didn't help that Jiraiya looked distinctly older than the last time Naruto had seen him, with extra warts dotting his nose and wrinkles crinkling around his eyes. The red markings that normally trailed from his eyes like tear tracks now looked like pools beneath them. Most strange were the 2 small toads perched on his shoulders. Weird. For his part, the Hokage seemed flabbergasted, staring at the blonde with mouth agape. "Naruto. You're alive. Where have you been?" "Time and place, Jiraiya," Naruto muttered, his response drowned out by the 2 toads debating between themselves and with Jiraiya. "To the Akatsuki Nin," he asked, "I assume your pain?" No, came the reply, both hands flat on the ground. Seals swirled beneath them, releasing the now familiar pop of the summoning technique, and when the smoke cleared, 5 orange-haired figures and 1 bald man with black facial piercings stood before teacher and student. "We are Pain," they chorused. Naruto got a brief glance at the collection of cloaked men before all but the ponytailed one split up to surround them. He noted where each one was with the green sight technique, blue eyes fixated on the man before him. Pain brought his hands together, and the blonde immediately pushed natural energy into the tree where he could sense a 7th chakra signature. The tree trunk compressed, crushing whoever was inside. The ponytailed Akatsuki collapsed, a puppet with its strings cut. Naruto body flickered, decapitating the falling Akatsuki with a bamboo sage art leaf cutter. The tree exploded in a hail of splinters. Naruto looked up at the sound of crunching tree bark, diving away from a downpour of wood, leaves, and, strangely, black metal. He performed a handspring, landing near Jiraiya as a person hit the ground with a grunt of pain. Beside him, the Sannin whispered, "Nagato? You know this guy?" he snapped. The other 5 Pain reappeared, congregating around the new person and shielding his emaciated form and lanky red hair from view. "Jiraiya, what the hell is going on?" "I don't know," replied the Sannin. His voice was strained. "Tsunade and I were fighting the summoner, some kinda immortal, and a big guy who can use all the elements. Through Katsuyu, we know that one can launch missiles," he pointed to the bald one, "and that one," he added, emotion choking his speech even further, "can control gravitational forces." He was pointing at the one front and center, orange hair spiked in a style similar to how Naruto had once worn his. Behind him, the Akatsuki with long hair rose, the fallen redhead's arms encircling his neck in a piggyback. "2 of them look like my students from long ago," the Hokage admitted quietly. Louder, the same tremor coloring his voice, he managed, "Yahiko, Nagato, what happened to you two? I heard you were dead. Where's Konan?" "There is no more Yahiko or Nagato," answered the redhead. "There is only Pain." "And Konan's dead," Naruto interjected. 6 sets of strange eyes and Jiraiya's dark-eyed gaze swiveled towards him, the Sannin's eyes wide in shock. The redhead's tired, stoic visage was crinkled with barely contained rage. "I killed her." "You killed? You?" The loathing in the redhead's voice was so palpable, Jiraiya was forced to swallow his comment, both he and Naruto turning their attention to the Akatsuki. His hoarse timbre vibrated with a fury contrary to the unmoving expressions on the faces of the other 5 Pains. "I had suspected that it was you, but now that I know, your death will be even more satisfying." The spiky-haired Pain held out his hand and uttered, "Bancho Tenin." Naruto felt himself pulled off his feet by an unknown force, body flying towards the Akatsuki members. "Son of a bitch." He snarled internally, barely registering Jiraiya's shout of his name. His hands came together, chest puffing out as he took a deep breath. "Dokujiri." Purple gas billowed from his mouth and fell over the array of Akatsuki. The long-haired Pain carrying the redhead, Nagato, jumped backwards from the poison gas technique, the spiky-haired Pain's hand wrapped around the blonde's throat as he was pulled forward. The Jinchuriki choked as Yahiko's grip tightened. "You're mine, Kyuubi." "Senpo, Gomen." Even though he couldn't see it, Naruto could smell the oil and feel the heat of the fire as it cascaded towards them. "Why isn't my poison working?" The heat of the fire disappeared, accompanied by a trio of voices chorusing an incredulous, "What?" "Great. Jiraiya's useless and I can't move. How about some help? You deign to seek help from another? How novel, hypocrite. Mock me or die, Kyuubi." The fox laughed. "As you wish." Red-orange chakra exploded from his skin and ripped through Yahiko's shoulder. Naruto dropped to the ground, the dismembered arm releasing its grip on his throat. He performed several seals and manipulated the earth beneath him, turning the ground to mud. There was a burst of smoke, and the blonde sped backwards to avoid being crushed by an oversized hoof. When he looked up, a massive ox loomed overhead. "Jiraiya," he growled, timbre guttural, "what's going on? My poison isn't working, and I killed the summoner. The fat one absorbed my jutsu. The last one summoned some sort of demonic statue that revived the summoner." "Great, so we're back at square one. Suggestions?" "Not yet. Senpo, Cho Otama Rasengan." The largest orb of blue chakra Naruto had ever seen impacted the ox, sending the massive mammal hurtling backwards through the forest. The Pains leaped out of the way, each one disappearing into the foliage with the exception of the bald one. He threw off his cloak, revealing 2 extra faces grafted to the sides of his head, 4 additional arms, and a serrated steel tail that reminded the blonde of Sasori, and panels all over his body opened up to fire a slew of missiles at teacher and student. Naruto swiped at the air, his claws creating a wave of wind that cleaved the projectiles in two, exploding them prematurely. Are they all like this one? Puppets, like Sasori? Was Conan the only actual human in Akatsuki? He screamed internally, frustration boiling over. His chakra flared with his temper, a third tail growing out of his spine. One of the fox shroud's tails reached out, formed into a claw, and grabbed the pain's tail as it shot out. Naruto yanked on the tail, bringing the puppet towards him, and then staggered as something solid slammed into his back. He righted himself and was promptly blown away by a massive force of air. Naruto looked skyward and bellowed, his cry turning into a roar of rage. Pion! His skin began to peel off, another tail sprouting behind him. Naruto! Jiraiya yelled. Get a hold of yourself. Pa, can you find them? We'll do what we can, Jiraiya-chan. Naruto disappeared and reappeared in front of the six-armed pain, punching a red-black fist through the puppet's chest. Gears exploded from the Akatsuki-nin in a shower of oil, and the Jinchuriki howled his success to the heavens. Shinra Tensei. Naruto was blown off the fallen pain and into the arms of the fat pain. His strength immediately began to dissipate, the Kyuubi's chakra siphoned off by the orange-haired man's technique. The blonde could hear the Kyuubi raging as his influence vanished, howls of how close he'd been to escaping on repeat in his mind. Selfish asshole. Said the pot to the kettle. Fuck you. Futon, Kakadai Kiri. When the expanding mist technique didn't explode the pockets of air between him and the fat pain, Naruto cursed to himself. Right, he can absorb chakra. Fine. Then he closed his eyes and summoned the surrounding natural energy to him. The boost of vitality and life that normally accompanied his use of natural energy faltered and died. Naruto opened his eyes, panic-stricken. He can absorb natural energy, too. Shit. The big pain with stern features appeared before him, summoning a demonic statue that swallowed the puppet pain. The latter stepped out from the statue's mouth seconds later, unharmed, and immediately after, the long-haired pain-carrying Nagato appeared before him. You cannot escape, Kyuubi, Nagato intoned, and Jiraiya cannot save you. The sounds of battle and the lack of two pains suggested the Hokage was otherwise engaged. Now you will experience pain unlike any you've felt before, and then you shall be sacrificed so the rest of the world will also understand that pain. The six-armed pain approached him, serrated tail at the ready to eviscerate the blonde. I never should have come back, Naruto realized. I'm so stupid. I should have done more research, I should have planned better, The tail shot towards him. And immediately veered to the side, decapitating the reviver pain. Naruto could only blink, a vague wah escaping his throat before all the panels on the puppet pain opened, revealing too many missiles to count. Naruto felt the grasp of the fat pain loosen as explosions began to rock the area, Nagato reflecting the blasts with a repulsive force. The blonde hit the ground and only years of instinctive self-preservation had him immediately sinking through it with the attack prevention technique. He resurfaced when the earth stopped thundering to find pieces of the puppet pain littering the forest floor. Flames devoured fallen detritus and feasted on all tree trunks within several hundred feet. Both the fat and reviver pains were on the ground, cloaks and hair burned away, skin charred, and limbs blown off their bodies. Several feet away, Nagato was being picked off the only patch of unmarred ground by the long-haired pain. Naruto reached for a Senbon and released an agonized holler, his skin crackling from where the explosions had been quicker than his reaction time. Gritting his teeth, he plucked a Senbon from his pouch with his left arm and aimed it at the pair, multiplying it with a Senbon shadow clone technique that pain blocked with his body. You're the only human, aren't you? Naruto directed at Nagato. Silence was his only response, broken by the sound of Jiraiya crashing through the foliage and shouting, Nagato, stop this madness. What you see as madness is just a path for mankind to understand each other through pain, Nagato intoned. Did you experience that pain when you killed Yahiko, sensei? Yahiko is dead, Jiraiya bit out. You're the one controlling all these bodies, Nagato, and you're the one who can stop this. Stop it, Jiraiya, Naruto ordered. He drew on just enough of the Kyuubi's chakra to heal the worst of his injuries, knowing that he wasn't in the right mindset to control any more even as the Biju urged him to do so. You can't reason with a madman. It is the rest of the world that is mad, Nagato asserted, raising his hand towards the blonde. And I shall bring order. Bancho ten in. Naruto again felt himself pulled towards the Akatsuki-nin, and again found himself held aloft by an orange-haired man. The Kyuubi's chakra began to flow towards Nagato, filling in his gaunt features and giving him a semblance of physicality. He can use the abilities of each of the individual pains, the blonde realized, his strength fading. His chest began to feel tight, and he looked down to find an ethereal specter being pulled from him. What is this? He gasped. A means to an end, Nagato informed him, voice cold. Your sacrifice is appreciated. Ranjishigami no Jutsu. A massive mane of white hair roared towards the trio. Nagato repelled it with a burst of power, but it merely bounced back, split into several strands, and wrapped around the two Akatsuki shinobi. Release him, Nagato, or else. Don't make threats you can't keep, sensei. Jiraiya's hair receded as Nagato absorbed the chakra within it. Naruto felt his whole body begin to shake as even more of the specter was pulled out. He watched Nagato absorb a stream of fire through half-lidded eyes, strength fading. The sound of something hard hitting flesh jerked Naruto back to attention, body collapsing as pain released his grip. Blue eyes opened to see Jiraiya standing over him in a defensive stance. There's a lull between his attacks, the Sannin explained. Figured it out when I was fighting ya, the other pain. Are you okay? Peachy, Naruto groaned. Any ideas? Kinda been gettin' my ass kicked. He can absorb any chakra-based attack we throw at him, and I think he can use every ability of the individual pains, but only when they aren't. That's why they keep dropping. But that means he can probably revive any of them if we don't stay on him. Yeah, well, I'm nearly out of steam. Me, too. The battle was just too fast and too varied for Naruto to keep track, nothing like his normal fights, or even the one he'd just won against Kisame. That he was running out of tricks didn't help anything either. I've got an idea, but you need to keep him busy. I don't know how easy that'll be. You're his target. Their conversation was interrupted by a two-story, feral-looking, brown-furred dog bearing down on them. Jiraiya leaped into battle with it, hair growing exponentially to tie it down. Naruto levered himself to a seated position, wincing at the effort. Exhaustion weighed him down like lead. Just a little longer. He formed seals slowly, settling on the final one and threading his chakra through the network of plants which weren't on fire. Haru Saicho no Jutsu. Without the use of natural energy, each flower bloomed slowly, brilliant pinks, blues, and yellows adding life to the ravaged forest. The blonde had a brief moment to admire the revitalized flora before Jiraiya crashed through the burning foliage, 3 giant dogs and a massive centipede toppling trees behind him. Any time now, he yelled to his former pupil. Yeah. He closed his eyes to summon natural energy and screamed when the sensory input hit him. His nerves blazed with anguish, far worse than before, every sinew and muscle burning with unending torment. He immediately released his connection to the natural world, too stunned to think clearly. Need to end this, he chanted, a mantra meant to inspire himself to push on. A little more, then I can rest. Gritting his teeth against the impending agony, he summoned natural energy to him once more, swallowing the scream that threatened to burst from his lips and releasing a high-pitched whimper instead. With his mantra in mind, he opened his eyes and placed his hands upon the ground, channeling what natural energy he could draw through the network of plants. Senpo, he thought, teeth clenched so hard he was sure he'd crack a tooth, aromaserapi. Every flower and even a number of trees began to give off pleasant odors. A mixture of sweet and earthy fragrances wafted through the forest, creating a serene atmosphere that seemed to soothe his aches, just a little. The sounds of battle quieted as the olfactory-based genjutsu took effect, lulling the summoned beasts, and even Jiraiya, to tranquility. For a moment, Naruto wished that he could allow himself to fully fall under the genjutsu's effect. The unending fire in his veins was excruciating, only matched by the blazing of the surrounding trees. It's the forest, he realized. When something destroys a lot of nature while I'm using natural energy, I feel it, too. He released the natural energy in his system, grimace loosening as the burning fading to a persistent irritation and slowly dissipated. No more senjutsu, he groaned internally. Unfortunately, the battle wasn't over, and Nagato, whether under the effect of the sage art, aromatherapy technique or not, was still out there. He clambered unsteadily to his feet and activated the green sight technique. Without natural energy, his range was limited, but he could still sense the Akatsuki nin nearby. Good enough. Naruto went underground and moved towards where he'd sensed Nagato. When he surfaced, carefully, as to not risk breaking the genjutsu, both the redhead and the long-haired pain were standing still, their backs to him. Perfect. He withdrew a senbon from his pouch, twirled it around his fingers, and swung it at Nagato's neck, wind chakra extending from its tip. Extra arms sprouted from Nagato's shoulder to catch the blonde's arm. Instead of extending an extra foot when Naruto summoned additional wind chakra, the elemental aura vanished, absorbed by the redhead's defensive technique. The long-haired pain turned and grabbed the Jinchuriki by the throat, painted fingernails digging deeper than necessary into tan skin. Clever, but ultimately fruitless, Kyubi, Nagato said over the wind user's choking. As is said, the third time is the charm. This was inevitable. Pain's free hand came to hover an inch from Naruto's stomach and then pulled back, once more withdrawing an ethereal specter. The demonic statue appeared beside him, mouth open wide in anticipation of the specter. Naruto gagged as body and soul were forcibly separated, pain's grip nearly crushing his larynx. He managed a final hacking gurgle as the spirit disconnected from his body, then burst into a cloud of purple smoke. Nagato coughed as the haze settled over his head and entered his lungs, belatedly dispersing it with a pulse of chakra. Wind rose in a cyclone as Naruto surfaced from the ground, the contracting funnel technique fully engulfing the Akatsuki nin in the remnants of his Doku Kage Bunshin. "You may think you're a god," the blonde informed his enemy, rigid disdain coloring his voice, not even sure the man could hear him, "but you're still just a human, like everyone else." Pain collapsed, Nagato falling from his back to the ground with a crumpled thud. Jiraiya chose that moment to make his entrance, bursting through the foliage with the blonde's name falling from his lips. He cut himself off when he noticed the scene before him, whispering with some degree of horror, "Nagato. Naruto, what did you do? He was a threat to my life." Blue eyes bore steely hatred into the fallen, gasping Akatsuki nin, finding sudden strength in his enemy's demise. And now he's not. He spared a glance at his former mentor, pausing when he noticed the older man's condition. Several of his stranger features had disappeared alongside the toads previously perched on his shoulders, blood soaking his tattered clothes from long gashes along his cheek, left arm, and chest. And that was just what he could see. Naruto was mildly surprised the man was still conscious from all the blood loss. "He was my student, and I failed him." Nagato let out a sputtering chuckle at that, drawing the pair's attention. "You have only ever failed, sensei." Jiraiya managed to look simultaneously ashamed and disheartened, and the Akatsuki nin turned his attention to the Jinchuriki. "Your life will always be in danger, Kyuubi. Killing me solves nothing. I get a target off my back," Naruto spat, "and your fucking organization out of my life. That's enough for me right now." Nagato's breath hitched in an effort to respond, but he failed, head lolling to the side. Naruto waited several seconds before breathing a long sigh of relief. "It's finally over. Naruto, we need to talk. Now." Relief soured to displeasure. "I guess so," he said, turning to the older man. "Forget I was here. You've been missing, presumed dead, for 5 years, and you think I'm just going to let you go?" Jiraiya exclaimed. "After I just watched my other student die? No, that's not going to happen. I want to know what the hell happened to you." The authority in his demand was abruptly undercut when he stumbled, falling to one knee and hacking up blood. "You should get that looked at." He turned to leave, but a bush of white hair ensnared him. Craning his neck revealed Jiraiya reaching towards him with one hand, teeth clenched together and one eye closed in concentration. "I'm not letting you leave. Doesn't seem like you have that option. Don't fight me, Jiraiya. You won't win." "Naruto." The blonde whirled to find Ino emerging from the forest, somehow looking as impeccable as always. She walked over to Jiraiya and knelt next to him, her hands aglow with gentle green light. Naruto watched, transfixed, as the Yamanaka dutifully healed the Sannin. Unbidden, he obeyed her silent entreaty to remain, waiting patiently for her to follow up. When the worst of the man's injuries were taken care of, Ino stood up. "Hokage-sama, may I speak to Naruto privately?" Jiraiya's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You don't seem very surprised by this development. Did you know Naruto was alive?" "I found out recently. May I speak with him privately?" she repeated. Jiraiya studied her for several more moments before finally waving his hand dismissively. Ino inclined her head and walked in the direction she'd come from, gesturing for Naruto to follow her. When they were out of the Sannin's earshot, she turned to face him and nodded towards the numerous cuts and burns that decorated his bare torso. "You look like you've been through the ringer. Want me to heal you? I'll live." The platinum blonde spared him a look that seemed to convey she thought he was being an idiot, but there was no way Naruto wanted to owe Ino anything more than he already did. "What are you doing here?" Blue eyes darted from side to side, as if expecting more Konoha nin to appear from the surrounding forest. "How'd you even find me?" Ino dug into her pocket and came out with a closed fist. Opening it revealed a small seed which had split open to reveal a tiny sprout. "I figured this wasn't normal, so I kept an eye out for your chakra signature and followed it." "How long have you?" And then he remembered the rescue that hadn't made sense. "Wait, can you mind control puppets?" She smirked at him with far too much self-satisfaction. Some members of the Yamanaka clan learned to project their consciousness into puppets during the wars with Suna. It's not common nowadays, but after Inogen was born, I figured it wouldn't hurt to have a few extra tricks up my sleeves. "Thank you," he offered sincerely. "I don't know." He cut himself off, knowing that finishing that sentence would involve admitting that he was truly indebted to the blonde. "Is Inogen safe?" Ino again gave him that look that made the blonde feel stupid for even asking. The first thing I made sure of when I got your warning. There was a pause before she continued, you care about him, don't you? Naruto's eyes flickered briefly away and then back, one foot toeing the ground. Is there something you wanted to talk about? His friend released an annoyed sigh, but seemed to accept his sidestep and asked, you're still not coming back, right? Even though you've been found out. He was silent for a long moment. Then he jerked his head in Jiraiya's direction. Come on. I'm not having this conversation twice. She followed him towards the Sannin, who looked surprised at their return. With authority he didn't know he possessed, especially given his state of exhaustion, the blonde demanded, Jiraiya, who's my father? What? You told me my mother was an Uzumaki, but you never said anything about my father, Naruto recited, voice becoming flat and almost cold. I found out recently that my father may have been the Yondaime. Beside him, Ino jerked a little in surprise, and I want to know if it's true. Now, Jiraiya, he demanded when the white-haired man didn't immediately respond. Your mother was Uzumaki Kushina, the Sannin replied with measured carefulness, and your father was my pupil, Namikaze Minato. The anger burning beneath his skin was familiar, a reminder of how using natural energy had felt with the land of fire aflame around him, only now it comforted instead of hurt him, confirming what he'd suspected for years. He bit out, and why was I never told any of this? We thought it was for the best, to protect you. This, Naruto snapped, whirling to face Ino, outstretched arm stabbing in Jiraiya's direction, is why I won't stay. I've been lied to my entire life by the people who control me, control us, and now that I'm only responsible for myself, you want me to come back under the thumb of people who won't trust me with the most basic information? Information I deserve to know? Did you ever lie to Inogen about me? No. I thought he deserved to know who you were. Naruto nodded. See, I grew up knowing nothing about my family. And even when I should have been old enough to be told, it was still kept from me. The Yondaime got nothing but respect, but me? Just hatred. Not knowing where I came from helped mold me into who I am, good and bad. Inogen should be given the opportunity one wasn't. I appreciate that you told him what I'm like, or was like, but he should figure that out himself. And if he chooses that he doesn't want to know me, then that's his choice, but it should be his choice. First-hand experience is the best way for people to learn what works for them. So no, I'm not coming back. Not permanently, anyway. I refuse to be controlled by people who only want to use me as a pawn and not see me as a person. But, I do want to keep seeing Inogen, so, I'm willing to keep our deal, he told Ino. Those are my terms. Naruto, Jiraiya interceded, if you leave Konoha again, we will stop you. The blonde scoffed, rolling his eyes at the older man. In your condition? I don't think so. If you leave, you will be listed in the bingo book. Jiraiya's voice was barely above frigid. You won't stop being chased until you're caught and brought back. What kind of example do you think you're setting for your son? Don't pretend you give a damn about the example I'm setting for Inogen, the blonde snapped. If you believed that, you would have done something to tell me who my father was years ago. This is about you controlling me, and I'm not having it. Jiraiya was silent under his former student's anger, but then pushed forward with stony authority. Fine. But what kind of life do you think you can keep, always on the run, looking over your shoulder? I've been on the run from Akatsuki for my entire life, Naruto rebutted, and I've been hiding out from you for the last 5 years. You could send whoever you want after me, whatever forces you still have after this mess, but it won't make a damn bit of difference. Naruto, Ino tried, why did you come back? Today, with all this happening. I've been in your mind, I know that this is what you've been avoiding for years, so why come back? They were after me, he responded, Akatsuki. That's why they came here. I found out, and I saw an opportunity to end this. To finally be free. And, he finally admitted, staring with such intensity into Ino's eyes that he hoped she understood his thoughts, I wanted to make sure you two were safe. There was silence among the trio, both Naruto and Jiraiya's forms fraught with tension, waiting for the other to make a move. To their surprise, Ino moved first, placing herself between them with the blonde at her back. Naruto wondered if she'd actually read his mind and received his message. Hokage-sama, you have to let him go. Yamanaka, while I respect the delicate position you may be in here. He hates it here, Ino interjected. He's hated it here for a very long time, and forcing him to stay isn't going to change anything. You'll have to lock him up, and not only does not that help anyone, but he'll never stop trying to get away. She tossed a glance backwards at her fellow blonde. I think he's resourceful enough to succeed. We reached an agreement recently. Naruto will pass information affecting Konoha he learns from the outside to me, and in return, he gets to see our son. Naruto's lips quirked at the corners, finding small comfort in his friend finally acknowledging that Inogen was more than just hers. In all his time as a nuke-nin, he never once did anything against Konoha. You may not like it, but Naruto's intentions aren't bad. He may be acting selfishly, but that doesn't mean he's working against us. The fact that he came back here to fight Akatsuki when it would have been in his interest to stay away should prove that. Jiraiya's lips were set in a grimace, every muscle in his face tight in reflection of his internal struggle. After a minute of silence, his whole form sagged, reluctant acceptance aging his battered body. Fine, he muttered, and there was a melancholic note of loss in his voice. I guess I don't really have a choice, huh? Yamanaka, you'll be his handler, or whatever you want to call it, he corrected when Naruto cleared his throat in protest. The Sannin rubbed a tired hand through his long hair and turned around to face the village. I guess if we want this kept a secret, I should head back to Konoha and check on the damage. Duties of the Hokage and all that. There'll be a power vacuum in AIM, Naruto tossed out. Pain was in charge there, and now that he's gone, who knows what'll happen. Fantastic. Thanks for the info at least. The Jinchuriki grunted in acknowledgement, and Jiraiya added, for what it's worth, I'm sorry we never told you about your father. If I could go back in time, well, there's a lot of things I would have done different. Naruto didn't bother responding. The scenario reminded him of Kakashi's compliment after he'd beaten Sasuke, and although Jiraiya's apology seemed heartfelt, a mixture of anger, pride, and irritation tempered his ability to accept it. The Sannin's shoulders slumped a little further in the ensuing silence, and when it became apparent that was all he was going to get, he took to the trees, leaving the two blondes alone. You didn't have to do that, he finally said. Ino turned to face him, one platinum blonde eyebrow raised in query. Oh? You mean you had a solution that didn't involve fighting the Hokage and running from ANBU for the rest of your life? Well, yeah, that's what I thought. Look, I know it's not your ideal solution, but you'll just have to trust me and Jiraiya-sama. You're not the problem, came the pointed retort. She smirked a little at that, and Naruto realized how satisfied she must feel knowing that she still had some sort of pull over him. Though the response had been more automatic than anything else, he knew that it wasn't any less true. The idea that he could trust someone else at this point was strange, but not as uncomfortable as he'd thought. Even after so much time, or, perhaps, because of it, and her mind reading, Ino understood him in a way no one else in Konoha did, and it was that trait that allowed him to willingly place himself at her behest, especially for a mutually beneficial cause. Softly, she said, thanks though, for coming back. It means more than you probably realize. Slowly, she took careful steps forward and placed her arms around his shoulders, bringing him in for a brief, tight hug. I'm not sure we would have survived. He remained frozen in the embrace, relaxing slightly when she moved back after a couple of seconds. I still care, you know? Despite trying to forget, he added mentally. I just need to live for me. Ino graced him with a sad smile. Yeah, I know. I'm not sure it'll mean much, but I think I can forgive you. Eventually, she clarified. It'll just take a bit to get used to this new version of you. Naruto nodded. I get it. He cocked his head, looking like a bird trying to hear something in the distance. Ino had never been so hard for him to read, and it bothered him that he didn't know what she ultimately wanted or thought when it seemed like he was an open book to her. The unbalance unnerved him, just a little. I should probably get going. I've got to recover from all this. I'll be back soon with another seed, okay? Sure. We'll see you soon. He nodded once more and then allowed the earth to swallow him whole. LLL. Zetsu released his jutsu when Naruto disappeared. Black Zetsu's yellow eye finished with recording the pair's interaction. The plantman's white side released a short whistle. Wow, that was some fight, huh? Both of them. He's certainly come a long way. So what do you think's next? He hummed in thought, at a rare loss for words. He'd gone through life treating it as a game, and the next move required consideration. When he'd worked for Kusa, the game had been survival, and the rules had been clear: obey the hierarchy. After he'd left, the rules had simply stopped existing. Reveling in anarchy was so much more entertaining than the drudgery of settling for being another cog in the machine. It was with that spirit that he'd interjected himself in Naruto's life, finding no small amount of glee in introducing chaos to the blonde's tiny worldview. Granted, his lessons had served a practical purpose in addition to entertainment, for Zetsu believed in wandering unexplored avenues, which could in turn lead to further branching roads, when they presented themselves, but Naruto had risen to each new challenge with aplomb. More impressively, he'd taken each new perspective presented to him and adjusted his worldview accordingly, manipulating his personal playbook until it was too complex for anyone else to understand. Zetsu suspected that there were moments when even Naruto hadn't been sure what the right move for him was, at internal conflict with some personal dichotomy, though he seemed to disguise his hesitancy beneath a facade of rigorous thought well enough. But that, the plant man supposed, was the truly astonishing part. Zetsu had consistently presented his disciple with options meant to shred his sanity and push him away from Konoha's order and towards freedom's chaos. That the Jinchuriki had spent years planning on how to escape the hidden leaf proved his efforts had been successful. Yet, based on the interaction of the two blondes, Naruto had clearly twisted those lessons into a different rulebook, where he could live in both worlds. He was perverse? Moral? Paradoxical. Black Zetsu allowed a deep, throaty chuckle to bubble forth as the realization hit him. Naruto had truly embraced his teachings if he'd been able to formulate a set of rules based on every decision running counterintuitive to itself. He's cheating. White Zetsu's normal eye blinked in confusion. What? He's cheating, asserted the renegade's dark half. He's set himself up as both independent from Konoha and yet reliant upon a select few to get what he wants. But even then, it doesn't truly matter if it falls through. Whatever scenario the blonde had envisioned himself living, he'd twisted it to create a situation where he was now simultaneously in control and at the behest of the platinum blonde. It sounds very ironic. It certainly is. He chuckled again. But what else should we expect? He learned from the best. Zetsu traced Naruto's chakra as he went back to his home in the land of grass. Back to where it all began, he mused aloud. Move forward by living in the past? More like learning from it, but yes, something like that. Then let's go. I want to see how this plays out. He melded into the ground and followed behind his disciple, eager to see what Naruto's next steps would be.